Hey, legends! It's your guy Chronos here, back with another epic what if scenario. Today, we're diving into What If Deku Had Metal Manipulation Part 1. Big shout out to BT for crafting this awesome story. As always, I appreciate your continuous support. You guys are the reason we keep this going strong. If you love My Hero Academia and can't get enough of these what if scenarios, make sure to smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss an update. Let's jump right in and see how Deku handles his new metal-bending powers. Prologue. Katsumi Bakugo had been a prodigy in every sense of the word, and by some twist of fate, was also my best friend. Showing hints of unparalleled skill even at a young age, no one ever hesitated to tell her how lucky she was to be so talented, that she was so blessed. Most agreed that she would go far. They were so blind to the hours spent with scrunched eyebrows, diligently copying kanji until they were just right. Oblivious to the scrapes and bruises from doggedly scaling to the tallest point on our preschool's jungle gym until she could do it with her eyes closed. All our classmates cared about was that Kaken was the first in the class to make it up there in the first place. It came as no surprise when at the age of 4 Katsumi ignited a classmate's shirt as she shoved him away in a schoolyard scuffle. Well, the situation itself was surprising. Even in a world full of superpowers, spontaneous combustion was usually cause for alarm. But after calming a screaming toddler, no one was surprised that the fiery blonde had developed a quirk to match her personality. The soft pops and cracks of the sparks that danced across her palms had been beyond mesmerizing to me at the time. It had only cemented Kaken's place as the coolest girl ever in my mind. The reality was less elegant, but no less impressive. She could secrete a substance from her sweat glands that performed much like nitroglycerin. Aside from the fact that it could be remotely detonated with a mere thought, it was a near flawless amalgamation of her parents' quirks, seemingly engineered in its efficiency. Auntie Natsuki could secrete glycerin from her skin, a comically innocuous ability considering how similar the woman was to her daughter, but when paired with her husband's ability to oxidize his sweat, the result was explosive. Katsumi wasn't the first of our small class to develop her powers, but hers was undoubtedly the flashiest. A quirk with power and versatility piled into a convenient little package. A hero's quirk. Kaken could be brash, short-fused, and downright confrontational on her best day, but she would undoubtedly put it to good use once she'd stopped accidentally lighting her assignments on fire. Weeks passed, and one by one, the children in our small daycare started developing their quirk, every ability fascinatingly unique, yet none with the same raw potential as Kaken's. There were only a handful of us who had yet to manifest our quirk. I'd always wondered if their heads were plagued with the same dark thoughts as mine had been. It had been reported that 1/5 of the current world population was quirkless, but many of that number were the elderly of the previous generation. The probability of being quirkless nowadays was incredibly unlikely. Highly improbable but not entirely impossible. Katsumi and I drifted apart when it became apparent that my quirk wasn't showing up anytime soon. Not that I really had any say in the matter. It was a miracle that she gave me the time of day in the first place. At least that's what I thought at the time. For months I satiated my hunger for learning about quirks by following the pros through online sites like Hero TV, having already meticulously studied my classmates' abilities. I eventually learned to write myself, channeling my obsession, and my frustration, into the very first volume of hero analysis for the future. But as fascinated as I was with the quirks of others, nothing would replace having one of my very own. The weeks passed, and I felt the chasm between my best friend and I only grow wider. I feared that I would be cursed with a label that would seal my fate for life. That I couldn't walk at Katsumi's side. That I wouldn't be gifted with the power to be a hero, until one day, I was. Chapter 1. Izuku O. It was a clear spring morning and Midoriya Izuku had just begun his first year of primary school. The young child sat huddled in the space between a scuffed metal equipment shed and the fence that ran the length of the small elementary school's yard. It was a hiding spot easily overlooked, but being a boy of small stature, slipping into the tight space was easy as pie. The reason he was hiding? Because he was a villain, of course. Well, he was playing a villain. The game was pretty much the main attraction for recess at Aldra Primary School. Kids miming their favorite heroes' special moves chased down others who did their best evil villain laughs. Such was the nature of a superpowered society. Letting children chase each other around the yard like maniacs was already tempting fate as it is. Add in rapidly developing quirks and the control of emotionally unstable almost 5-year-olds, and you have a recipe for chaos. To say Fubuki-sensei wasn't quite as strict as she could have been about quirk usage during recess would be a gross understatement. But you really couldn't blame the woman. If teachers were underpaid before the quirk revolution, then what were they now? Izuku smiled lightly at the distant staccato cracks of Kaken's quirk at work. A few months and she was already propelling herself around with small explosions like she'd been doing it for years. He wondered how all their friends missed the slight burn marks around her hands while they praised her acrobatic displays. Izuku knew for a fact that her body was resistant to her own explosions. It was one of the first things he noted on Kaken's hero page. To think she would injure herself practicing in spite of that. Her dedication was frightening, and yet Izuku couldn't help but admire her with the same wide-eyed joy he had when they were younger. "Deku!" a voice said from behind. "Ah. He'd been found." One offhand comment from Kaken about the characters in his name, and some of the crueler kids in their class had latched on to the insult with vicious glee. Being the last in the class without a quirk didn't help make many friends, so the name stuck. Izuku was sure she'd never even meant anything by it, but as perceptive as the young boy was, deciphering Katsumi's various glares was a skill he was still working on. She'd been different lately. Had she finally given up on hanging out with the quirkless loser? "Oh, Deku! What the hell is this thing?" the voice said with a bit more heat. Izuku flinched away from the voice and turned to see that it was Endo, one of the friends he'd run around with in the past before their quirks had complicated everything. The taller boy's attention was not on Izuku as he initially thought, but instead poking his spindly, elongated fingers into, what was that? Confusion came first. Endo-kun's quirk was long fingers, not the most inventive name, but that was to be expected as Izuku always thought the boy was a few crayons short of a full box. But if this wasn't his then, it's finally happened! The words ghosted past his lips as he stared in wonder at the orb of shifting metal floating before his very eyes. It was around the size of a baseball, and bobbed and weaved through the air as if riding the waves of his disbelief. Izuku had never seen anything quite like it before, not in all his time spent analyzing quirks. His shoulders somehow managed to sag in relief and straighten with confidence simultaneously. It would be fair to say that he didn't know quite what to think. He felt the tingling warmth starting to radiate from his gut. Was this what the other kids all felt? Could he be a hero that inspired people by the mere mention of his name? The orb shivered in response, sunlight refracting over its pearlescent surface. Izuku paused, noting the odd behavior. Was it a response to his mood? He'd have to add that to the tests. So much to do. Could it be controlled? What was it made of? Is there— "Hey look! Useless got himself a quirk!" The shout cut through Izuku's habitual rambling, and a spike of fear shot through the young boy. Most of the class had gathered around from the disturbance, and in his experience being the center of attention never ended well. "Whoa!" gasped a student with gills and webbed ears. "Way cool! What's it do?" yelled another boy with an extra arm growing over his right shoulder. The others began shouting over each other, all clamoring to get a look at the spectacle. Izuku shrunk slightly as the voices blended together, the many students starting to yell over each other. But this was loads better than the hushed whispers and careless words he'd endured for the last few months. He shot a sidelong glance at Katsumi, who had stayed surprisingly quiet. Her startlingly crimson eyes widened slightly as they moved from the orb floating timidly by Izuku's side before meeting his own. She glanced away immediately with feigned indifference, but Izuku had known the girl long enough to see the interest hidden beneath the surface. There was something else there as well, something he couldn't quite identify. "Settle down, children," Fubuki-sensei chided with the patience of a saint. She turned to the green-haired child. "Congratulations, Izuku, it seems you were just a late bloomer after all. Why don't you show the class your quirk?" He faltered for a moment under the intense scrutiny. I just now saw it myself, so I don't really know. Can you make it move?" shouted a boy in the back. A flush spread across freckled cheeks. He just now got his quirk and they already wanted some kind of demonstration. He furrowed his brows in concentration, hoping, pleading, for the wobbling orb of liquid metal to do something, anything. But no matter what he tried, from screaming commands in his head to gesturing wildly with his hands, the orb remained almost mockingly still. Having to perform on the spot wasn't really helping matters, but Izuku was certainly convinced by this point that his own quirk had it out for him. Embarrassment was joined by shame as all Izuku's classmates all quickly lost interest. Katsumi hesitated for a moment, that same, unreadable look on her face. Was she angry at him? Disappointed? The girl's chaotic platinum blonde hair shook slightly as she finally turned away with a dismissive "TCH." He wouldn't lie, seeing her walk away so casually stung. He had held some hope that some of their friendship remained, especially now that he had a quirk, but it figured someone of her caliber wouldn't have wanted to be friends with someone like him. His classmates' reactions might have crushed someone of weaker will, but Midoriya Izuku was going to be a hero. That was indisputable. And now he had a quirk of his own. For nearly half a year he'd done nothing besides analyzing unique abilities. If there was one thing he was confident in, it was figuring out his own. He strode back to the classroom with as much poise as his near 5-year-old frame could manage. Izuku yanked out Hero Analysis for the Future, Volume 1, and turned to the first blank page. With a manic determination he wrote in bold, black letters across the top of the page, "Subject, Midoriya Izuku. Quirk, quick steel. Katsumi. Shit shit. A harsh crack and a gout of flames licked harmlessly at the fire-retardant walls of the Bakugo residence, but the concussive force of Katsumi's rage rattled the windows of the small home. Oi brat! The fuck did I say about explosions in the house? Came the incensed yell of her mother from down the hall. Shut up, you old hag! The girl grumbled under her breath. What was that? Love you, mother dearest. Of all the skills she'd picked up in her short life, sarcasm was one of her favorites. It was perfect for covering up how much her mom's inhuman hearing unnerved her. Bakugo Mitsuki certainly didn't need a quirk to be terrifying. Katsumi had just arrived home after an eventful day at her primary school, and perhaps trying to burn her house down wasn't the most logical reaction to said events. But damn it, she was pissed. She was so close to getting the stupid nerd to stop throwing his life away. She knew Izuku had the heart of the hero. Of course she did. Having spent the greater part of their childhoods together, how could she miss his selfless nature? How kind he was to people even at the expense of his own happiness. Katsumi recalled the very last time they'd hung out together. How he choked down his least favorite flavor of snack mix, just so she could have the spicy miso flavor. And how did she repay him? A wave of guilt washed over her, as she recalled the state of her friendship with the kind boy. But she also knew how his kindness would get him killed one day. Even being labeled a prodigy from a young age, Katsumi had no illusions to the kind of life a hero lead. Hell, it was what had attracted her to being one in the first place. That, and the enthusiasm of a wide-eyed, green-haired kid that looked at her like she was the next All Might. Constantly throwing yourself headlong into danger with no regard for your own safety was the life of a hero. The best heroes always came out on top, but some didn't. If you didn't have the power to back up all that self-sacrifice, then what was the damn point? As the weeks passed and Izuku's quirklessness seemed more inevitable, Katsumi's belief was only strengthened. She knew even being quirkless wouldn't put a stop to the boy's ambition. His selflessness was only matched by his stubborn streak a mile long. He'd probably have just called it a setback. Katsumi scoffed. She stomped into her room before flopping to her bed in a heap. Why won't you just give up? Deku? She sighed. The name tasted bitter on her tongue. A careless comment turned into a cruel taunt reused endlessly by their peers. She was still learning her kanji back then, damn it. Regret stabbed at her thinking back on how she'd been treating her friend these past few months. Where they were once inseparable, there was now a wide chasm between them. All her fault, of course. She couldn't bear to take part in the bullying, but standing by while it happened, while her wonderful, selfless nerd of a best friend was harassed by their reject classmates, was just as bad if not worse. Her palms crackled along with her agitation, the destructive power eager to be unleashed on those damn extras. She'd have to settle for her pillow, at least until one of those idiots gave her an excuse to throw down. Katsumi had hoped that the constant bullying would be enough to discourage him from being a hero so he could put that big dumb brain of his to good use curing cancer or some shit. She should have known better. Not only did the nerd still want to be a hero, but he still looked at her with those same fucking eyes. Like she could do no wrong. It sickened her. She didn't deserve that look, not after abandoning him to the cruelty of their classmates. Just one more week, she had told herself, not for the first time since this had all started. But it had all been ruined, all by that shitty useless quirk. Katsumi had convinced herself that Izuku was close to giving it all up. She wasn't sure exactly where they'd stand once he did, but she planned to deal with it when it finally happened. That was all thrown out the window when the nerd showed up halfway through a game of heroes and villains with a goddamn quirk. A full 4.5 months after the last kid in their class got theirs. For a moment her blood had run cold. Had her actions the past months all been for nothing? But even before seeing what his quirk could actually do, or couldn't as it had turned out, she had reassured herself that it wouldn't have mattered. A quirk did not change someone's personality, and as selfless he was, Izuku was simply too timid to be a hero. If the nerd couldn't stand up for himself, how could he stand up for others? Her conclusion was only reaffirmed a moment later when Izuku's quirk proved to be as weak as its owner. Not only would it reignite his drive to be a hero, but it would do absolutely nothing to keep him safe. Shitty floating blob, she growled, steeling herself for the drama that was sure to come. Katsumi knew she didn't deserve his forgiveness, but she selfishly hoped he'd give it one day all the same. Izuku, it seems to be a radical mutation of your own quirk, Midoriya-san. The doctor's office was typical. Scholarly and pristine came to mind describing the decor, but he'd always felt this place was too formal to ever be comfortable. Izuku sat attentively, despite the quirk's specialist ignoring him entirely in favor of his mother. He was used to such treatment by this point, as adults tended to not take young children too seriously. Izuku didn't hold it against the man. It wasn't unreasonable to expect children to act like, well, children. Izuku's mother stared the doctor down, a polite smile on her face as Izuku wondered not for the first time, which god he pleased to have such a nice mom. She coughed subtly and nodded towards her son before the doctor took a hint and addressed the boy himself. Izuku wiped at a tear threatening to fall and steeled himself. This was about his quirk. He had to be assertive, and so, the questions began. Are we sure there's no influence from my father's quirk? He could breathe fire, the boy asked excitedly. The doctor looked cautiously surprised but answered anyway. Whatever this material is, he started, peering curiously at the shiny orb bobbing serenely over the young boy's head. Whatever it is, even though you currently have no willful control over it, given how it responds to your emotions, we can assume that you have some sort of telekinetic connection to the material. A mutation of your mother's quirk is the most likely scenario, though it's yet to be seen if you retain any temperature manipulation from your father. He sat thoughtfully for a moment. These things tend to develop over time. Izuku practically had stars in his eyes as terms like develop and temperature manipulation were thrown around like this doctor wasn't currently exceeding every meager expectation he set at the start of this visit. Of course, he had seen it firsthand in some of his classmates, even over the relatively short time since they'd had their quirks. Even with his classmates' lukewarm reactions, it was still nice to receive some confirmation that there was a chance his quirk would not remain so frighteningly pointless. He took a deep breath, ready to dive back into the questions he'd prepared specifically for this visit. What did you mean, whatever this material is? Well, you see, the equipment we use in this building to test for heavy metal toxicity in the bloodstream did not recognize the sample we took of your quirk. It's not so unreasonable as our tests are specifically geared to detect certain metals, but you'll have to send a sample to a more specialized facility to find out more. Izuku nodded like a maniac, already planning his own experimentation. He panicked for a moment as the doctor checked his watch, not for the first time that evening. Not yet. He had so many more questions, but the most important one of all sprang to the front of his mind. Sensei, wait! With this quirk, can I be a hero with a quirk like this? The question came out much more timidly than he had intended, but the doctor still managed to hear. The man shrugged casually. Maybe. I think that's up to you at this point. That concludes our allotted time. I have another appointment due in 5 minutes. Izuku and his mother were escorted out of the office, the young boy with a spring in his step that wasn't present on the way in. It may have taken an offhand comment from an apathetic quirk doctor for him to believe it, but for the first time in months, life was looking up for Izuku. Chapter 2. A Happy Accident. Izuku. It took Izuku 6 months to use his quirk with any sort of purpose. Even after tinkering with his ability every day after school, he had only managed to move the quick steel short distances out of its default orbit. It was progress, but not nearly enough to be considered useful, so he kept his practice to himself. Izuku figured the name he'd chosen on a whim was as good as any. He had read about the element mercury before, and he thought it was cool how it stayed a liquid at room temperature. So, he settled for quick steel, as a play on the slang term for mercury. The quirk registry didn't seem to mind the invented name once they realized how truly unique his ability was. The bullying, of course, continued, and Katsumi remained as distant as ever, if not a bit quicker to anger than before. Was she really enjoying being surrounded by the classmates that sung her praises so easily? It really didn't look like it. He preferred Kaken's confident grin much more than the scowl she wore these days. School was the same, remarkably mundane even in this world of super-powered humans. To pass the time, Izuku had taken to meditating in his time alone between classes. Finding that having a better handle on his emotions stopped the quick steel from flitting around out of his control. Following the referral from the original quirk specialist, Izuku and his mother arranged for a sample of his metal to analyzed by a lab out of the country. The results were due any day now. Hopefully they would give him some insight on the potential of his quirk. He'd already filled a notebook with speculation, but he wanted answers. Oh, Izuku, honey, it's here! The boy in question raced down the hall to meet his mother at the door. His eyes practically sparkled and his all-might hoodie flapped in the wind. Inko smiled knowingly at his enthusiasm, aware of how eagerly her son had been waiting for the results of his tests. Izuku snatched the letter from her hand as politely as possible with a quick "Thanks, Mom!" He barely made it back to his room before he began poring over the report. There were countless pages of data that went over Izuku's head, but several points of interest were summarized at the end. Izuku had been correct in his observation of the similarities between his quirk and the chemical mercury. They both had a relatively low melting point, resulting in its liquid state at room temperature. However, that is where the similarities ended. After extensive testing, it was determined that the material sampled from Izuku's quirk did not occur naturally in the world. Despite sharing similar properties to several elements, it did not match any single one perfectly. Its density exceeded his quirk's namesake, even rivaling gold, one of the densest naturally occurring elements. Perhaps the most crucial detail was the unknown metal's incredible tensile strength when it was cooled below its melting points, changing from a liquid to a solid. The words overall strength comparable to carbon steel jumped out to Izuku's verdant eyes as they frantically trailed back and forth over the scrawled notes. It looked like the name he had chosen was more appropriate than he had initially thought. The pointed tip of Izuku's pencil blurred across the lined paper of his personal notebook as the aspiring hero detailed what this new information meant for his own quirk training. Knowing that his quirk had the potential to be great was one thing. Now he just had to figure out if he even had the ability to control the temperature of his quick steel. Izuku prayed for some sort of influence from his father's quirk. It would be nice to have something from the man, having never actually met him face to face. He didn't really have anything personal against his dad. But even with his mother's attempts to not influence Izuku's opinion of his father, it's not like he had any experiences to base that opinion on. He briefly entertained the idea of asking his mom if he could contact the man for advice, but something stopped him. Midori Enko was always more hesitant than usual when he asked about his dad, and she worried enough without added anything extra to her plate. No, Izuku would have to figure this out for himself. For nearly a year, Izuku dedicated most of his free time towards practicing with his quirk. He was largely unsuccessful. Altering the temperature of the material generated by his quirk proved to be much more difficult than he had imagined despite improving his control over its liquid state. He even managed to shape it into various shapes, but until he could solidify those forms his progress was at a standstill. According to the infrared thermometer he had asked his mother to purchase online, he had barely managed to lower the temperature of his quirk more than a few degrees at a time. Granted, it was validating for Izuku that doing so was even possible in the first place, and he was as enthusiastic as ever as he regaled his bemused mother with tales of how he'd raised it almost 2 degrees today. Unfortunately, it meant nothing until he could completely solidify quick steel. It would open a whole new array of possibilities once he succeeded. Izuku knew he couldn't only rely on his quirk as a hero and fully intended to train his body once he was a bit older. But at the moment, anything past basic fitness would only do more harm than good to his still developing body. Izuku felt like his progress had plateaued. He went to school, as was expected of every child, aspiring hero in training or not. He paid as much attention in lessons as he could manage, often catching on to the concepts faster than his peers. Izuku of course kept up his hero analysis, filling volumes 2, 3 and 4 of hero analysis for the future. Though his peers' overall opinion of him didn't change much, Izuku's ability to brush off their harsh words only improved with his greater emotional control and self-esteem. His daily meditation succeeded at improving his control over his quirk, but a welcome side effect was his reduced anxiety, and the subsequent boost to his confidence. For some, however, words were not enough to assert their superiority. Izuku had been cornered on several occasions by some of his classmates, though he'd been escaping with less and less hassle and bruises every time. His bullies weren't very creative with their attempts to reassure him of his uselessness, and where Izuku was lacking in strength he made up for in agility, able to slip away given the smallest opportunity. Izuku might have been a bit more upset that the primary school teachers allowed such blatant bullying to occur in their classrooms. That is if it hadn't led to his first real breakthrough in months. It was silly really. Izuku was making his way to the back row of their classroom. He'd been lucky enough to be assigned a seat in the back that year. It allowed him to avoid the unwanted attention of his peers for most of the day. That day was the rare exception. Izuku's eyes were bleary and unfocused from lack of sleep the previous night. A group of villains had tried to rob a bank in downtown Mizurufu and had ended up taking hostages. Of course, being the avid hero fan that he was, Izuku had been up all night watching the live news feed of all the action. Eventually Pro-Hero Snipe had taken out the aggressors with a non-lethal application of his quirk from long range, keeping the hostages, not to mention bystanders, out of harm's way. Being in such a state of unrest, Izuku didn't notice the leg stuck out intending to trip him as he normally would. Teiji Kugo was a brat, and his quirk, telescopic knee, wasn't likely to ever be put to better use than tripping up kids in school hallways. Not that the quirk itself lacked potential, but the ugly personality it was attached to sure did. In fact, if Izuku wasn't one of the boy's most frequent targets he might have been quite interested in how such a quirk worked from an anatomical standpoint. However, Izuku was a frequent target of the boy's bullying, and the rapidly approaching ground lent credence to that fact. Izuku's hand darted out towards the closest desk in an effort to save himself, but he missed by a mere centimeter, leaving himself at gravity's mercy. This was it. This is where it all ends. Until it wasn't. Izuku gaped at his hand hovering around a foot above the floor, braced sturdily against the flat, wonderfully solid disc of quick steel. In his shock he pulled his hand away, leaning on a desk by his side. After a moment the slight indentation of his handprint that was left in the metal slowly smoothed over, the quick steel reverting back to its natural liquid state. Was he dreaming? Izuku's eyes widened, darting around to see if anyone had noticed. Katsumi's gaze had darted towards him at the sound of the commotion, but judging from the snickers of Kugo's cronies, they had only seen him stumble. The quick save from his quirk must have happened under the desks and out of sight. His classmates had seen the orb zip around many times in response to Izuku's heightened emotions, so there was no reason they would be suspicious. Izuku trudged to his desk, quelling the violent urge to voice the flurry of ideas bouncing around in his head, a habit he had all but broken in the previous year or so. He wrenched his backpack open and snatched his personal notebook out of the main pocket. The familiar cool touch of paper under his fingers calmed him slightly and settled his thoughts. He had done it. But how? What had changed? How were the conditions different? All his other attempts at solidifying quick steel before this point had resulted in lackluster results. Izuku tapped his pencil rhythmically against a blank page, his mind running a mile a minute. Had he been thinking about it wrong this entire time? In all his past experiments, he was focused on the science behind it all. He thought cool this below its melting point. It was logically sound, but entirely too clinical for something that should be a part of him. Like an extension of his own body. All that had been on Izuku's mind just moments ago was stop falling. The tapping stopped. That was the difference. That was the state of mind he needed to achieve, the overwhelming need for a certain result. He replayed the situation in his mind as best he could remember. Izuku had reflexively moved his quirk to catch himself despite never having succeeded before. But judging from the imprint his hand left in the quick steel, it hadn't finished, or possibly even started hardening until his hand had touched it. Could skin contact have anything to do with his seemingly random success? He had touched his quick steel while training before, of course, but Izuku couldn't help but feel his quirk was somehow stronger in that moment of panic. He'd never been able to test lifting anything with his quirk since any object would just fall through in its liquid state, no matter how much he compressed the material. But supporting his whole body? Izuku had felt something in that moment that was new to the boy: strength. Besides the slight bit of give that prevented any permanent damage to his wrist from the impact, his telekinetic grasp over quick steel held strong. It was unwavering under the weight of his admittedly small frame. Would he be able to recreate what just happened? Could it support his whole body? His hands twitched, eager to touch the metal again, even surrounded as he was by all his classmates. Midoriya! Do something about that, please, you're distracting the other students. His eyes snapped to the front of the classroom where their English teacher had shouted from. Apparently, Izuku's tenuous control over quick steel had lapsed, leaving it free to dance about in the space above his head. Its normally spherical base form wobbled and undulated below the surface, projecting its master's joy for the world to see. The inevitable round of laughter was a few decibels louder than earlier, but it was nothing in the face of Izuku's newfound success. He muttered a quick apology, and the quick steel settled as he regained a grasp over his excitement. Let them laugh. He'd get his turn when he was finally accepted by Yue. The green-haired boy hid a grin with hunched shoulders and a bowed head. He had years until he could practically, not to mention legally, use his quirk to help people. But he also knew that that time would fly by in the blink of an eye. Izuku certainly had his work cut out for him. He couldn't wait. Izuku stood in the center of his bedroom, lids resting over his normally expressive green eyes. He exuded a sense of serenity, as if he was utterly unconcerned with the world around him. This, however, was a ruse. Izuku's focus, razor-sharp, was centered on that familiar weight in the corner of his mind. The total command of the mass of metal that was as much a part of him as the rest of his body. Even now, blind to the world around him, he could sense the shifting quick steel floating before him. He engaged his quirk, gently coaxing the material into the shape he needed. The quick steel shivered, slowly thinning out, flattening into a disc around half a meter in diameter. He'd of course tried to replicate the incident from 2 weeks previously the first moment he had to himself. He'd rushed up to his room for his first attempt the minute he had gotten home from school, stunning his mother in as he passed in the hall with his vigor. She'd gotten used to the more outgoing boy Izuku had become, but even this had been a bit much for a normal day. His results had been slow at first, but by the end of the night he had managed to solidify quick steel into several different shapes. He'd sure paid for it the next morning. Pulling 2 all-nighters in a row couldn't be healthy. He'd been correct in both of his assumptions. Skin contact was indeed required, at least at the moment, for the hardening effect he had managed to reproduce. Perhaps of even more significance was the added power to the telekinetic aspect of his quirk if he physically handled it. The potential of such a development was incomprehensible to the young boy. The metal he controlled was dense, and his quirk seemed to produce a maximum amount of it, directionally proportionate to either his age or his body's physical development. Either was a possible explanation at this point, since the orb had grown to the size of a grapefruit in the time since it had appeared. Even the small amount his quirk produced currently was enough to pack a serious punch if traveling with enough force. Force he was now more than capable of creating while physically handling his quirk's constructs. Offensive weapons, defensive shields and armor, With enough practice, only his imagination would be the limit. Maybe if he got good enough, he could augment his own strength with the force generated by his telekinesis. Scenes of Izuku as a fully realized hero bounced around the young boy's imagination, a thin layering of quick steel covering his arms as he stood heroically between a crowd of innocents and the shadowy villain threatening them. The fine control needed to keep quick steel flexible enough to mold to the moving joints and muscles of his arms while retaining its defensive properties was something Izuku knew was simply out of his reach at the moment. That would require years of practice, and for the moment was shelved for something of quite a bit higher priority to the boy. His focus returned to the disc of metal floating a few centimeters off the ground. As amazing a hero All Might was, there was something even the symbol of peace himself wasn't capable of. It was a staple ability of a hero even when the notion was purely fantasy. Izuku believed it was well within his power the minute he felt the strength of his quirk those 2 weeks previous. He needed a platform, somewhere where he could stand. He flooded his body with the will needed to convey the command as he lightly stepped onto the shimmering pool. The metal was cool, but not uncomfortably so on his bare feet. The shining metal platform seemed to shimmer in the air, its form wobbling for a moment, before it settled into a solid disc. Izuku braced himself for this next part. Keeping quick steel solid through contact with the soles of his feet proved to be significantly harder than doing so with his hands. For a moment he had considered that he might be working backwards by learning to channel his hardening through his feet, before mastering using his hands. But what would that accomplish always taking the easy way? He wanted to fly, damn it. Could Kaken shoot explosions from her feet? As far as he knew, skin contact of any nature gave him increased control over his quick steel, but maybe it changed from quirk to quirk. Izuku gently shifted the weight from his left foot to his right, still planted firmly on the surface of his platform before stepping up with his full weight. This is where he had fallen the most in the past week. Simultaneously balancing himself on his disc while controlling it mentally was incredibly taxing, taking all the aspiring hero's concentration. For a few seconds he stood steady, letting out an ecstatic cry at his success before a brief lapse in concentration sent him sprawling to the hardwood floor. The dull thud of his fall shook the hero figurines decorating his shelves and echoed throughout the small apartment. "Izuku, are you all right?" came the worried call from his mother down the hall. "Fine, Mom." Despite his apparent failure, Izuku had a wide grin adorning his features as he rubbed at his future bruises. That had been his most successful attempt to date. This totally might work. When Izuku asked his mother to buy him a longboard a few weeks later, he was prepared for many reactions. Luckily, or perhaps no so much, spontaneously fainting was indeed one of the reactions he had predicted. As such, he was prepared with a sheet of quick steel that gently cradled her form and lowered her to the couch conveniently located several meters away. His mother's nervous disposition was a part of her personality he had already grown quite used to. While it was a result of her highly empathetic nature and would never change that part of her, it did leave her a bit out of order in times of stress. He put a kettle on to boil, knowing his mom might appreciate a cup of tea when she rejoined the land of the living. She woke just a moment later, as Izuku knew she would, with a cry of, "Not one of those rolling death traps." He sighed, convincing her might be a bit harder than he had imagined. There were several excuses he could use to explain away his request, but in this instance he settled for the truth. His request was entirely reasonable after all. He only hoped that her worry for him wouldn't override her sense of reason. "I can ride my quirk like a board," he explained quickly, shucking off his shoes to demonstrate to his mother. He settled on floating platform with a fraction of the time and effort, a testament to having practiced religiously over the last few weeks. "Honey, that's amazing!" Izuku yelped as his feet left the platform, and while he was shaken around like a rag doll in his mother's hug. "You're going to be such a cool hero, Izuku," she whispered warmly. Izuku relaxed in her grip, returning the hug as his chest glowed with affection for this woman. She had said so many times by this point, but frankly he would never tired of his mother's confidence in his success. "I can hover in place just fine," Izuku said once she had released him. He hopped back onto the disc in one fluid motion, wobbling slightly as the surface drifted around the room at a consistent height. "But my balance still isn't the best," he explained, scowling uncharacteristically at the focus it took just to stay upright. "That's still wonderfully impressive, Izuku," his mother replied with stars in her eyes. He blushed slightly, still working on accepting compliments with grace, though this time was easier, as he was personally just as satisfied with his own progress. It's what drove him to keep improving, seeing himself grow stronger with each day of practice. "That's why I wanted the longboard," he said, stepping down to the floor and returning autonomy to his quirk. It floated airily to shoulder height, the orb's preferred location to flit around while Izuku wasn't exerting his will. "I figured it would improve my balance while learning without having to be too far above ground or having to focus on controlling the platform itself." Inko took a few moments to think to herself before nodding simply. "It's for your safety then?" He smiled at his mother. The hard part was done with. Right, Mom, it's for my safety, in a way. Then I see no problem. She smiled sweetly. As long as you wear a helmet. He nodded with a bit of exasperation. It wasn't an unreasonable request, and Izuku was sure he'd be falling plenty of times before getting the hang of it. They shook on it, and Izuku rushed off with his mother's credit card to make the purchase, having preemptively decided on a board after weighing the pros and cons of each model extensively. Izuku was pleasantly surprised when the package came the next day. But his mother had commented that nowadays postal services often augmented their standard delivery routines with individuals whose quirks were suited to the task. It was a gentle reminder to Izuku that there were literally billions of people on the planet with quirks, and only a minuscule percent of them became pro-heroes. It really put his goal into perspective. To be considered great, he would have to work harder than every other kid with the same aspirations as himself. It wasn't exactly rare to dream to be a hero after all. Izuku coming home with a couple scrapes and bruises was the norm in the Midoriya household for the next couple of days. But for once, Inko looked on with fond exasperation instead of anxious fretting. Maybe it was because these were injuries from pursuing a passion rather than those inflicted by his classmates. He knew she probably didn't believe his excuses about the cause of some of his previous injuries. Izuku had bought a drop-down longboard, thinking it might simulate the motion of flying with his quirk better than a shorter deck. He rode to school for the last 2 days of the school week before spending hours over the weekend coasting around an empty parking lot he'd found just down the street from his apartment. Izuku was stuck somewhere between training his balance for his quirk and genuinely enjoying the sport of it. The rush of the wind in his face and his already gravity-defying hair whipping around his head was incredibly calming. But the rush as he flew down even a reasonably gentle slope was exhilarating. He could barely imagine what it would be like when he finally managed to slice through the sky with his own power. He took some spills, of course, some nastier than others. However, that was a natural part of the learning process, and learning to fall correctly was never a lesson that would go to waste for a hero. Izuku didn't lack intelligence, and was indeed a quick study. Even a more physically leaning task, which he'd struggled with in the past, was no match for his perseverance. Once he'd gotten a decent amount of experience under his belt, Izuku took to it like a fish to water. He honestly may have been hooked. Life continued for Izuku as he fell into a comfortable routine. He rode to and from school, and as he grew older, spent increasing amounts of time prowling the streets after they'd been let out for the day. Chasing down heroes to catch the action live proved much easier with wheels than on foot, and Izuku found himself spending hours after school tracking down heroes and documenting new quirks firsthand. What started as a personal hobby of taking particularly detailed notes turned into something much more. His hero analytics were as good as if not better than an encyclopedia of every relevant hero that had hit the big time in the last several years. Analytics and stat charts detailed everything from a hero's level of physical fitness to their quirk strengths and weaknesses. Volume 7 was coming along quite nicely with only 10 pages or so left to fill, leaving the last couple pages for an index, of course. Weekends were reserved for Izuku to practice with his quirk, as he was under no illusions that he could ride on an extra axis without any practice. Honing his skill at manipulating quick steel was slow progress as usual, and Izuku suspected it would always be so. The only way to truly master one's quirk, and anything really, was with mileage, so he practiced. A lot. Izuku found convenient spot to practice at the local junkyard. At least that's what he thought it was, until his mom told him about the pristine beach it was when she was younger. Clearing a space to work with took several hours, but in the end, it was time well spent considering he'd been able to test out augmenting his strength with his quirk. The result was a space on the sand where falling from his hoverboard wouldn't cause permanent injury. Izuku planned to clear a bit more of the trash out with every visit over the next several years. Hauling the junk littering the sand would work as well as anything else to help hone his quirk, and hey, maybe he could clear out the beach with enough time. He eyed some of the stacks of abandoned vehicles that loomed meters over his head. Maybe not. The metal that clung to his hands now was misshapen and clumsy-looking, more like 2 platforms stuck to his palms than a thin coating. But it was the bare minimum he needed to move the larger pieces of junk, and it was all Izuku could manage yet. It did the job, aiding Izuku in lifting the old appliances that his still-developing body normally wouldn't be able to tackle. Controlling quick steel in separate pieces seemed to half the force he could exert on each, not to mention the added difficulty of focusing on 2 things at once. The seemingly mindless task of clearing the beach 1 weekend at a time would serve Izuku in 2 ways. Flexing his quirk in more strenuous situations would hopefully strengthen it over time while simultaneously gaining some finesse with his ability. Now, however, he stuck to hauling trash and during rest periods, tried to harden quick steel without the crutch of skin contact. He imagined his control would always be stronger with than without, but being able to move things, or people, remotely would be exceedingly useful. He continued in the same vein as the seasons changed, time passed, and his life was stable for once. It wasn't until Izuku's first day at Aldera Secondary School that everything was thrown out of balance. Chapter 3. The Turning Point. Oh Katsumi oh. There were many types of anger. This was a fact Katsumi knew all too well. There was of course the blinding, seething rage that only appeared in the rarest of circumstances. The target of that kind usually came to regret whatever they had done to earn her attention in the first place. Her reject classmates always crowding around her were more of a mild annoyance, barely classifying as anger. But this deep-seated, long-lasting parasite of a feeling in her gut was a cut above the rest. The source of her ire? Midoriya fucking Izuku, of course. Who else had the ability to leave her both apoplectic and so horribly conflicted in the same moment? No one, that's who! Her mother had mumbled some bullshit about a match, but Katsumi had stopped listening to her rants years ago. The woman had the audacity to tell her to not explode morons when they annoyed her. The hell kinda advice was that? That wasn't helpful at all. That, however, didn't get rid of her current problem. Katsumi wasn't even sure what to do at this point. For her admittedly short life, she had always tried to live at full throttle and without regrets. She may have screwed up that second part. Damn nerd was one huge regret. Izuku had changed, and Katsumi was still baffled that she was the only one who noticed it. She had expected some shift in attitude, of course. Katsumi would have even welcomed a bit of bravado from the boy. God knows he could use it. The nerd was already dead set on being a hero even before that glorified mood ring of a quirk appeared. She'd known, of course, that once his quirk had appeared, he'd only be even more determined, but she'd remained aloof in a last-ditch effort to keep him out of harm's way. Determined he may be, but Katsumi had refused to let such a kind, brilliant mind go to waste trying to keep up with all the dangerous quirks tossed around by villains. At least that was what she thought at the time. Frankly, it seemed that the only thing about Izuku that remained the same were those same selfless qualities, and of course his utter obsession with quirks, no matter who they belonged to. Gone was the eternal stutter, replaced with a quiet confidence. The quick-witted mind Katsumi knew from when they were young and inseparable was finally allowed to shine. Even though she'd initially hoped the bullying would discourage Izuku from hero work, she was inwardly cackling every time he'd slip past his tormentors. The idiots always tried to corner him when the teachers weren't looking, but she couldn't remember the last time she'd actually seen someone catch him. He'd always slip in an underhanded comment and slink away before they'd even registered his words. She swore Endo still spaced out sometimes trying to figure out some of Izuku's more creative burns. Katsumi might not have been able to admit it to herself, but her plan was a bust by this point. Izuku had lost his timid nature, and he just held himself differently. He walked like someone who would change the world. She didn't hate it, but how could she expect to just go back to how things were before she'd fucked it all up? That was even more delusional. Now, she and Izuku had barely spoken in years, let alone been on friendly terms. And the damn nerd was still going to be a hero anyway. Yes, going to be. She had no doubt that Izuku would somehow manage to slip through the cracks, even with such a weak quirk. He'd somehow put that big brain to use and find a way. Even as kids, he'd always been doggedly following in her footsteps, no matter how hard a path she chose. She also knew he'd be an easy target for the millions that turned to villainy over an honest day's work. Being smart could only get you so far. Katsumi choked down the familiar pangs of guilt that welled within her. What were all the weekends spent in solitude for? The beatings Izuku had endured in her absence. She could have protected him. She should have protected him. She chewed on her thumbnail anxiously, lip curling into a grimace. He must be sickened by the sight of her. What kind of friend abandoned you in your greatest time of need? Katsumi's foul mood had only worsened by the time she'd made it to school, and the sight of the dreary building ahead only loosened the girl's already tenuous grip on her sanity. It was a typical public school, lacking all the notoriety and prestige of some of the more expensive private schools around the country. It was the kind of institution that rarely saw students go on to legendary schools like UA. A school by extras for extras, she mused quietly, the beginnings of a sneer stretching across her deceptively fair features. Katsumi's eyes dropped to the filthy sidewalk, littered with dried gum and trash. This was pretty much the standard here at Aldera Educational Institute. The sight of 2 pairs of black scuff marks streaking across the sidewalk immediately snapped her mind back to the boy she was trying to forget. The longboard strapped to the back of his red backpack was a familiar sight by now. The first time the nerd had come to school with that thing, he'd had to go, sorry, limp to the nurse's office before class even started. What the hell was Auntie Inko thinking? The overprotective mother didn't strike Katsumi as the kind of person who'd let him get away with some shit like that. More importantly, what the hell had gotten into Deku? Longboarding? Where had that even come from? Up until this point, all he'd been interested in was heroes, quirks, and pretty much any combination of the two. As far as Katsumi knew, there were no heroes that rode any sort of board, at least not in Japan, and Izuku wasn't the kind of thrill-seeker that would be attracted to that sort of thing out of the blue. Frankly, after having watched some videos on the sport online, it was something she would have loved doing. Bombing down winding hills at over 100 kilometers per hour? Sign her the hell up. But that was the exact reason that the nerd's sudden interest was so bizarre. Their personalities were like night and day, at least back when she was still his friend. Had he really changed that much in so little time? The thought left a bitter taste in her mouth. Whatever, she didn't care. If Izuku wanted to break his neck imitating some obscure pro-hero, then that was none of her business. Admittedly, he hadn't come to school bruised and battered for a few years now. She'd even occasionally catch a glimpse of him from a distance, racing down the hills of Muzurufu, before he'd zip out of sight, moving way faster than she thought possible. Katsumi made her way through scuffed and tagged double doors of AEI. The campus was a combination of a middle and high school divisions, located in two separate buildings. The hallways stank of underfunded public education, and she reminded herself for perhaps the 100th time that she'd only have to slum it for another 6 years. She cursed under her breath. That was way too fucking long. Just a mere 6 years until she could take her rightful place with the rest of the Eli. Well, look what we have here, boys. She slowed her pace and turned to the voice. 4 boys stood shoulder to shoulder, one standing slightly in front of the rest. She eyed the secondary school uniforms they all wore. The pins stuck to their jackets labeled them as being third years. They all wore their uniforms untucked and without the tie, of course. Wouldn't want people to think they were lame or something. Gag. They stood crowded around one of the hallways leading from the main plaza to the junior high section of the campus. The bell had already rung, meaning the group was waiting here for a specific reason. Katsumi didn't think it would take her 3 guesses for why. Was this really happening? To her? It was 8 in the morning on her first day of middle school, and she so didn't have time for this shit. Katsumi eyed the leader with feigned indifference, noting his dramatically oversized forearms and the strange coiled mechanism that seemed to merge seamlessly into his flesh. A mutant type then? Mistaking her silence for submission, he swaggered up to her, speaking once more. Word on the block is there's some hotshot moving up into middle school the teachers are calling a genius. That's you, right? The 3 other guys sneered down at Katsumi as she stared with lidded eyes, utterly uninterested. A genius? That was a new one. Probably the least accurate of all the ridiculous titles people had given her over the years. Prodigy, once in a generation, she'd heard them all at one point or another. But more importantly, were these fucking extras really pulling this shit right here? Right here by the main plaza of the school? Sure, it was a bit out of the way and in a hallway that wasn't really in direct view of the main office, but still. Katsumi felt a flash of righteous anger flood through her system. She had too much shit to figure out already to have to deal with these idiots so early in the morning. You see, we thought we'd do our cute little Kohai a favor and knock her down a few pegs before she got too big a head. Goddamn, how long did this monkey practice that line in the mirror this morning? Look, why don't you cut the Yakuza routine? You're just embarrassing yourself. Katsumi drawled. She turned away to find her homeroom classroom. She was already late enough. Katsumi cursed as her foot slammed into an opaque barrier that sprung into existence in front of her. Really? Katsumi kicked at the air experimentally. Her boots tapped audibly against the surface, despite nothing physically being there. She found the barrier solid even after reaching out to touch it at eye level. Her exit was thoroughly cut off. Deep breaths, Katsumi. Don't explode the extras. She exhaled heavily out of her nose, turning back to the group of 4 with pale eyebrows narrowed over crimson irises. The goon standing to Fat Hand's left held his palms together like he was praying, or some shit. Either he was scared as fuck for his friend or it was a part of his quirk. Katsumi couldn't quite tell, but it looked like the boy might be holding his breath as well. Her lips curved into a subtle smirk. Izuku would probably have been raving about all the ways spawning barrier walls could be used to save people, but Katsumi's mind ran on a bit of a different wavelength. She picked apart the weaknesses of such a gated emitter type, estimating the kind of cooldown someone with such an ability might have. Would he be able to spawn a second shield? Was there a time limit? Their vulnerabilities. The leader's first step towards her was heavy with implication, his grin as large and as fake as the gold chain that rattled around his neck. A familiar tingling sensation arced across Katsumi's palms, her quirk yearning to be unleashed, but she clamped down on the urge. Not quite yet. She saw the wide left swing coming from a mile away, telegraphed and clumsy. If any of her opponents had seen the grin that split Katsumi's lips at that moment, they might have reconsidered their plans. All right, assholes, since you were kind enough to throw the first punch. Katsumi ducked into the larger boy's swing, throwing an elbow strike to his solar plexus. The older boy reflexively doubled over in pain, and Katsumi let loose a devastating explosion-aided open palm uppercut to his jaw. Just die already! Finally, she had an excuse to blow off some steam. Ikai! You alright, man? Called the third guy in their group, seeing his leader slumped over in pain. He was thin, and had long, blue-gray hair that fell to his shoulders. The boy was sweating and had an anxious look on his face. Kid probably hadn't even wanted to be here in the first place. Katsumi smirked. She wouldn't want to fight her either. She let out a huff of air, turning to the others of the pitiful excuse for a gang. No reason to let them regroup. It's not like this was a manga or something. With a carefully applied explosion of all force and minimal heat, Katsumi burst across the distance between them, planting a fist in the gut of the idiot with the barrier quirk. If he thought she was just going to let him sit there blocking her only exit, then he was dumber than he looked. Not that she had any intention of running. Katsumi ducked to the right, rolling out of the way as a rumbling surge of power echoed throughout the hallway. She turned, seeing the scuffed-up ground where she had been standing moments earlier. Crouched with his hand raised toward her was Fat Hands, dark orange hair plastered to his brow with sweat. A faint blue glow from the mechanism in his arm reflected off the deranged look in his eyes. Sound waves, huh? Probably strong short to medium range, and a fairly slow projectile speed if she'd been able to dodge it instinctively. It really was too early for this shit, she sighed heavily. It didn't really matter. This kid wasn't even a pebble on the side of the road to her. He was an afterthought really, in the greater scheme of things, but he made the mistake of challenging her directly. What would people think if she didn't live up to all their wonderful expectations? She rushed the leader with an explosion for speed, leaning her weight back with bent knees as she slid under his weak right hook. Capitalizing on the larger boy's hesitation, Katsumi delivering a powerful blow to his kidney. All it took was a textbook leg sweep and he dropped like a house of cards. The nervous-looking boy who had spoken up earlier had turned tail in the confusion, leaving the only remaining crony approaching with blind anger in his eyes. Katsumi made short work of the boy, his mutation quirk that gave him the legs and tail of a lizard only affording him a bit of extra mobility. Perhaps the claws would have posed a threat had Katsumi given him an opportunity to even use them. Would his tail grow back if she exploded it off? No. Not worth the trouble, plus someone would have heard all that. Katsumi glanced at the scorched walls of the hallway and the whimpering forms of the downed upperclassmen. Shit, hopefully these idiots would be too fucking embarrassed to rat her out. She could already hear the lecture from her mother if she was busted for fighting at school. As much as the teachers groveled at her feet, even she might not get away with brawling in the hallways. They usually came down hard on unlicensed quirk usage in a fight. Just as she was about to walk off to finally make it to class, the walls of the hallway lit up with an arctic blue glow. She turned in time to catch sight of a beam of energy rushing towards her. Her feet were mid-step, making it awkward to dodge, so Katsumi shot off an explosion from one arm in a last-ditch effort to avoid the blast. It worked to some degree, but the shot from her blind spot had proved too hard to sidestep completely even with her animalistic reactions. It clipped her left side, knocking the breath from her lungs and tossing her across the hall. Katsumi tumbled to a heap, wheezing as she tried to regain her breath. The pain was negligible. What wasn't, however, that fucking bastard did not just shoot her in the back with his bootleg present mic bullshit. Katsumi saw red. Before he had even seen her move, she was crouched before him, a palm smoldering a devilish crimson. The first blast flung the ape that even tried to challenge her into the filthy hallway wall, spittle flying from his mouth as flesh met unforgiving concrete. She blast jumped after him, lost to the frenzy of battle, a right hook humming with explosive firepower swinging towards the defenseless upperclassman. Her quirk yearned for retribution. Katsumi's eyes picked up movement in her peripherals before the attack connected. The explosion was blinding in its intensity, not to mention the boom that echoed off the enclosed acoustics of the hallway. Hell yeah! Even her ears rung from that one. But something was wrong. Katsumi's application of explosion was incredibly fine-tuned, the product of years of practice and research. The amount of chemical she had released for that attack should have resulted in a significantly bigger bang. The smoke cleared, and one of her questions was answered, but so many more came to mind. Before her stood none other than Midori Izuku, kind, green eyes narrowed and burning with a fire she had only seen from him on rare occasions. But wait. Izuku had just tanked one of her stronger explosions barehanded. No. That wasn't right. His hand wasn't bare, it was shiny and meta. Oh no. I think that's enough kaken. Katsumi's stomach plummeted. She knew what this probably looked like. Of course he would show up at precisely this moment, when it looked like she was mercilessly beating down the defenseless. It wasn't exactly her first schoolyard fight after all, but his eyes didn't hold any of the scorn she expected, only that infuriatingly gentle, disgustingly gentle look he always got. Honest eyes pierced through her as if none of the walls she'd packed around her for years had meant anything. Katsumi's jaw tightened as she scowled reflexively, breaking eye contact before him for once. Izuku just stood there. The glossy surface of what she assumed was his decidedly not useless quirk reflected the sunlight peeking into the hallway. This is where he would tell her that he was disgusted with her. Katsumi just knew it. He would berate her for the years she left him alone, before leaving her alone, just like she deserved. Ignoring the rational part of her mind that told her the boy before her wasn't capable of such cruelty, she followed her body's instinctive response to vulnerability. Her legs had started moving before she'd even registered it herself. Katsumi made it through the school entrance before he could see the first tear fall. Oh, Izuku, oh. 5 minutes earlier. Oh god, he was so freaking late. The previous day, Izuku had caught wind of a curious rumor on one of the forums he frequented. Someone had said that All Might would be making an appearance at a 5K charity run in the business district of uptown Mizurufu early this morning, so Izuku had chanced riding into town to scope the place out before school. The All Might was a lie. How cruel. It had all turned out to be just that, a rumor. There was indeed a charity event, but instead of the symbol of peace there was an appearance by a well-known local hero instead. Izuku had nothing against Crimson Riot, but he was no All Might. Then again, was anyone really All Might? Had anyone even come close? That might not be the best scale to judge a hero by. Did All Might seem so inhumanly powerful to the other top heroes as well? There really was only one way to find out, but attaining that level was a far-off goal for the green-haired youth. Regardless, he was now frighteningly late, bombing down the last hill before AI at close to 80 kilometers an hour. He torqued his core around halfway down the slope, whipping his board 90 degrees into a slide. Izuku reveled in the familiar loss of traction, letting his momentum practically float him over the asphalt. He let out a shout, a confident grin plastered across the young boy's face as he drifted into the last turn at the bottom of the hill, turning onto Aldera Drive. Izuku rarely had to use his quirk to correct his balance anymore, only protecting his palms while hand sliding. What had started as a glorified training exercise had turned into a genuine hobby, not to mention his main mode of transportation, and Izuku couldn't get enough of it. He uncharacteristically cursed under his breath as the echoing ring of the first warning bell sounded from off in the distance. And on his first day of middle school too. His obsession with heroes may be getting a bit out of hand. To think that he'd let himself be late on such an important day. But it was All Might though. He rolled up to the main building, hopped off his board and seeing that no one was around, snatched it off the ground with a tendril of quick steel, already sprinting up the steps and taking the first turn down the left hallway. Just as he was about to take the right turn from the main plaza of the school, his classroom in the junior high building, he heard a disturbance from the hallways leading between the two main wings. Curious, and resigned to being late anyway, Izuku peered around the corner, only to flinch away as a blinding flash of light bathed the hallway in orange, searing his eyes in the process. The sound followed a millisecond after, a harsh boom that Izuku could feel hit his chest. He had reflexively thrown up a concave shield of quick steel in response to a potential attack, but it never came. He turned back in the hallway, eyes searching for the reason Katsumi had set off such a large-scale attack, for who else could be the cause of such a blast? His eyes widened as he took in the scene. He marked the two down upperclassmen in his head, one clutching his stomach in pain, and the other on his back, reptilian legs twitching as he struggled to get up. Katsumi practically blurred as she rushed towards the third, who was currently splayed spread-eagled against the gray wall. This was the most likely victim of the explosion from earlier. Judging by the sparks trailing Katsumi's palm, it wasn't to be the last. Izuku's legs moved before he knew it, launching himself in between the two fighters as quick steel molded over his right hand and halfway up his forearm. He felt the impact of the blow immediately, and once again was reminded of how absurdly powerful this girl was. Even with his telekinetic control over quick steel reinforcing his natural strength, he was almost blown away from the force. The heat washed over him uncomfortably but not to dangerous levels. He managed to redirect most of the blast up and away from him, and the boy cowering at his ankles. What Izuku didn't expect, however, was the wave of fatigue that washed over him. What could that have been? It had never happened before while using his quirk, not even hauling fridges down at Dagoba Beach. Did quick steel struggle with kinetic force? That would pose a problem for hero work, but there was also the heat of Katsumi's explosion to consider. Such a limitation could be problematic, but it was something he could work around. The smoke cleared and Izuku saw Katsumi's eyes widen imperceptibly. Her brows shot up as soon as she identified him. Reasonable, considering the times Izuku stood up to her in their childhood could be counted on a single hand. "I think that's enough, Kaken." The tension of the situation leaked into his tone, and the words came out a bit harsher than he had intended. This was the first true interaction he'd had with the girl in years after all, and he found her about to throw away everything she'd worked for. Izuku simply couldn't let her go through with that. But this wasn't the reaction he had expected at his intervention. Anger was expected. Anger would have been normal. This guilt and regret that shone so evidently in her eyes, that wasn't the Kaken that he knew at all. Why was she looking at him like that? Like she actually gave a shit. She rarely looked at anything like that anymore, let alone him. Before he could ponder the enigmatic blonde any further, she broke the eye contact with a clenched jaw, teeth practically cracking under the pressure. Was she angry after all? However, in another moment Katsumi was gone, the distant cracks of her quirk the only indication that she had even been there in the first place. Well, that, and the 3 older students lying in their own drool, and the scorch marks on the walls. He licked a finger and pinched out a small flame that clung to his school uniform with a sigh. Shit! Izuku started at the sound of approaching footsteps, most likely a teacher sent to investigate the explosions. After deliberating for a moment, as much as his studious nature screamed at him to go to class, he followed instincts and rushed after the fleeing blonde. His dark red chucks tapped rhythmically against the linoleum floor as Izuku raced down the halls. Taking a deep breath, he meticulously shaped the full volume of his quick steel into a sleek, pin-tailed board, letting it hover at his side once he was satisfied with the length and shape. Something about that look on Katsumi's face as she'd run told him he'd regret letting her go. The worst she could do was tell him to leave her alone. Well, not really, but she'd never hurt him. Right. Izuku hopped along comically as he tried to yank off his shoes and socks while running. He finally succeeded as he rounded the corner and bolted out the front door. Izuku took a running leap off the front steps without a second thought. That brief moment of weightlessness, as he hung in the air, was immortalized in Izuku's mind. The shining spring sun, beating down on his hair and slowly warming the cool morning air. The distant noises of construction on the breeze. The familiar weight at the edge of his mind that was always there, the mass of quick steel that was his to command. He glanced down, and his own face, split into a joyful grin, stared back. The smooth surface of the board almost like a mirror as it floated below him. Izuku's bare feet met the frigid surface of the quick steel, his control becoming more fine-tuned with the skin contact. A faint thrumming sound vibrated throughout his body from where his feet met the board. It was a minor indication of whenever he was particularly forceful with his quirk. A burst of displaced air, and he was off. It was the lack of friction that was so hard to get used to the first time round. The concrete scraping under fast-moving wheels, speed wobbles, the momentum gained by drifting into turns. These were all things he used to measure and adjust his weight and balance while riding. But in the air, and moving the board with his mind, he had none of that information to go off. He essentially had to relearn how to balance, something that had initially seemed impossible. He'd figured it out eventually. Izuku crouched into a speed tuck to maximize aerodynamics as he accelerated with his mind. Multitasking between controlling the board and balancing his own weight was another problem he ran into. But at least with that he'd already had practice moving his quirk in other ways. It had taken longer than he'd admit, but he'd eventually figured out how to feel the location of the board in space, and use that information to balance. It had taken years of practice, but Izuku finally felt comfortable enough to move at speeds comparable to his regular longboard. But that was when he was on the beach. Over delightedly soft, definitely not concrete sand. Unfortunately, the hard planes and sharp angles of urban Muzidafu were quite a bit more unforgiving, and even his helmet wouldn't really do much if he fell from even a couple feet off the ground. But he needed the aerial view to see where Katsumi had gone. He wasn't sure what he'd say when he caught up to her, but he'd seen that look before. For months he'd had to look at it in the mirror every day, but he'd worry about all that after he found her. Izuku let out a whoop of joy as he zipped through a highway overpass, skidding the tail end of his board against the sidewalk. The shower of sparks that was unleashed illuminated his face with a strobe-like orange light, but the whining, buzzsaw-like sound that echoed off the cement walls took the fun out of it pretty quickly. He zipped out of the tunnel, and the world was bright with sunlight once more. Izuku took to the skies, his heart pounding in his chest as the biting wind whipped his hair into his eyes. He kept the curly mess a bit longer than when he was younger, though he really wondered why. It was horribly impractical, especially for him. Once he'd stopped worrying about being so high up, Izuku had taken to surfing through the air, or skyboarding as he'd been internally calling it, like white on rice. Izuku already had the instincts after all. He skated every single day. After not finding Katsumi in the general vicinity of their school, Izuku resigned himself to missing the first day entirely. The situation might have been funny in any other context. Both he and Kaken's perfect attendance records would be broken on the same day. Where could she have gone? Not having any better ideas, Izuku started checking all the places they used to hang out as kids. She might have gone home, but generally the girl didn't like talking to her mom when she was upset, not to mention having to explain why she was home so early on a school day. That discussion would come in time, but Izuku knew Katsumi would put it off until the very last minute to avoid the wrath of the Bakugo matriarch for as long as possible. He checked the playground that was the stage of many of their adventures together as children. It was within a few minutes walking distance of their house, but he found it abandoned save for a couple entertaining a young toddler on the swing set. Izuku grinned as the kid pointed and waved at him with a look of awe as Izuku flew overhead, his parents unaware. Gliding along the path that ran parallel to a shallow stream, Izuku began to reminisce about all the time he'd spent chasing his friends up and down the massive park. Back when he had them anyway. He meant park in the loosest sense of the word. The sheer size of it was massive. Even looking from an aerial view as he was now, the grounds sprawled on for miles. It was the kind of place that could be both wondrous and terrifying for a child that age. They used to get lost for hours exploring every nook and cranny of the place. Every day brought a new adventure, all guided by the whims of a group of 4-year-olds. The grassy slope that led to the stream grew sheer as Izuku traveled further into more overgrown parts of the land. He came across a rotted wooden bridge that crossed the stream and led into a deeply forested area, the trees knotted and branching every which way. Izuku had a good feeling about this next spot. He slowed to a stop, wheeling the board to the ground once more. Stepping back onto solid ground, Izuku wobbled on unsteady legs for a moment. Guess this is what sailors mean by sea legs, huh? He took an uncertain step forward, following it up with another when his legs remained steady. This spot was particularly familiar to the boy. He remembered vividly the day that he and Kaken had first come here with some of their friends from school. She'd been dared by one of the boys to climb one of the tallest trees in the place. This was before she'd gotten her quirk too. Katsumi had done it in a heartbeat, of course, always one to rise to a challenge even at that age. It was the first of many times they'd come back to the same tree. Even after Katsumi developed her quirk, Izuku knew for a fact she'd been back. He'd come from time to time as well, though they'd never gone together again after that day. That's why he couldn't let her leave while looking so defeated, not if he could do something about it. Making his way through the trees, his quick steel orb bobbed behind him idly. Izuku cut a familiar path through the undergrowth, coming out to a clearing dominated by a massive oak tree. Its branches were full of foliage and stretched across nearly the entire area. Seated on a gnarled branch around 20 meters up the aged trunk was Katsumi. The little sun that made it through the canopy overhead speckled her platinum blonde hair with morning light. Couldn't keep your nose to yourself, Deku? Her voice was hoarse, barely audible to the boy, and lacked all the heat he knew she was capable of. You haven't called me that since the very first time, Kaken. If you want me gone, then you're going to have to do better than that. She didn't answer, and the distant sound of a cicada chirping cut the silence like a sharpened blade. Can we talk? He called up again, the words awkward after so many years' silence. She seemed to think for a moment. Do what you want, but... A bit of the familiar flare came to her eyes as she shot him a challenging smirk. Only if you come up here, nerd. Ah, so that was her angle. In the past, Izuku would never have dared to climb so high up, often choosing to sit on a branch several meters below the much more daring girl. A grin stole across his freckled face. If Kaken thought that would stop him now, then she was in for a surprise. Silently, quick steel molded itself into a disc, like the very first time he tried all those years ago. It lacked the streamlined design of the board he'd ridden to the clearing, but would serve to prove a point just as well as anything. Izuku stood on the metallic platform, feeling it stiffen under his still bare feet. He willed it to rise silently through the air, slowly coming to a stop once he was eye to eye with a wide-eyed and speechless Katsumi. Your quirk, but I'm supposed to be the one with the stammering problem, Kaken, he said, chuckling lightly. She turned away, that same look from before coming to her eyes. And was she blushing? What the hell? Will you tell me what's wrong? Izuku decided to be blunt about it. People beating around the bush usually only annoyed the blonde. She'd seemed surprised at that, stiffening slightly before glancing suspiciously in Izuku's direction. Her eyes lingered on the silvery platform holding him nearly 20 meters in the air, marveling at his ability. Your quirk, nerd, it's gotten stronger, she said, ignoring his request. Yeah, well, I've been practicing, a lot. And it's been a while since you've been around, plus it took me a while to really figure it out myself. I'd like to have had a few more years before you got to see, but... He trailed off, rubbing his arm nervously. Geez, talked to her for 2 minutes, and he's already rambling like he's 4 again. Wait, back the hell up. Katsumi's voice cut through the self-chiding thoughts. Why would you want me to see it? Oh well, I didn't really mean any. You said you specifically. She insisted, like a dog with a bone. Why? Izuku hesitated. He knew why, of course he did, but admitting that to her? That after all these years of her ignoring his very existence, that he still yearned for a sliver of that simple, easy friendship they'd had so long ago. That he still missed her every day, that would be a nightmare. But that didn't change the fact that, here she was, talking to him like he'd asked her to, just like he'd imagined for all those lonely years, and she was expecting an answer. He couldn't lie, she'd know immediately. She always did, not that he'd had many occasions to lie to her in the first place. He couldn't run, as that would defeat the point of having chased her all the way out here in the first place. So he was left with one option. It's just... I guess I sort of held some hope that I showed you I could be strong, that you might finally acknowledge me, And we could maybe be friends again? The silence that stretched between the two was agonizing for Izuku. Izuku looked up to meet her eyes once more only to blink in shock at something he had never seen before. Katsumi sat with despair written across her disarmingly delicate features, and tears, actual tears pooling in her eyes as they returned to staring at the forest floor, meters below. No! Don't you get it? You're supposed to hate me. Yell at me, kick my ass like I deserve. You probably even could now, right? She shouted, head still bowed. I left you alone. You're not supposed to want to be my friend. The hell is wrong with you? She lashed out with a blazing palm, but Izuku deftly ducked under the blast. It was a superficial attack at best, zero power or intent behind it. Izuku had no idea what to do. This was a side of Kaken that he'd never seen before. The anger was expected, but the wetness streaking her cheeks? Yeah, that was a new one. Though he'd had a lot of experience with crying women from his mother, he was fairly sure that what calmed Inko would only serve to enrage the younger girl. What could even quality as the appropriate response here? He'd be the first to admit that he was way out of his depth with this one. He stepped off his platform, taking a seat on the branch next to his distraught friend. They merely sat in silence for a moment before he spoke up once more. I'm sorry that happened to you earlier, he said. The hell do you mean, nerd? She muttered under her breath, the change of subjects taking her by surprise. Those 3 guys from before? They, 4. What? There were 4 of them. One ditched the other 3 halfway through the fight, if you could even call it that. She scoffed, absent-mindedly snapping a twig off a nearby branch. The show of confidence had Izuku feeling optimistic at the direction of their conversation. Right, 4. He conceded. I'm sorry you were ambushed like that. The sound of fabric scratching against bark had him turning to meet crimson eyes staring back in shock. He let out a short bark of laughter. What? Kaken, give me some credit. Did you think I'd report you for bullying or something? I know you better than that. He winced as the words slipped past his mouth, unintentionally bringing up a sore topic for the both of them. Katsumi turned to face forward again, hanging her head. I know you were never part of it, you know, the bullying, Izuku said quietly. I never stopped it either. I learned to stand up for myself, he said simply, a smile tugging at his lips. You shouldn't have had to, Katsumi whispered, her shoulders slumped. Not alone. He didn't really have an answer to that. Izuku wouldn't lie. Losing her companionship had stung more than any of the name-calling or even the rare instances of physical abuse. No, the crushing sense of loneliness was certainly the sharpest weapon in that period of Izuku's life. The sounds of the forest filled the silence once more, life for the flora and fauna surrounding them so much simpler than the intricacies of human emotion. Was there a good reason at least? Izuku asked. Of course. This was always something that tugged at the back of his mind in his rare moments of idle thought. Why? Why was he denied the company of his best friend for so long? Because he didn't have a quirk? What about after he did? Was he not good enough? After nearly a minute of silence, he thought she wouldn't answer. Katsumi, was there a good reason? She had certainly felt like there was at the time, but hindsight had proved her plans to be little more than the ill-conceived delusions of a child. I was trying to keep you alive, she finally choked out, ignoring his wince at the broken tone of her voice. Selfless to a fault, even when he should hate her guts. But you tanked one my hits, nerd. Mine. And you can fucking fly. Her voice rose as her mind finally registered how he'd gotten up there in the first place. Katsumi had nearly had a damn heart attack when she opened her eyes and he'd been standing face to face with her. What do you mean you were trying to protect me? Figures that this was the part he had latched onto immediately. She looked away guiltily, but when she spoke, it was with conviction. This was the part of her argument that was entirely sound after all. We watched hero videos all the time when we were brats. All Might never loses. But not everyone can be All Might, right? She had worked herself up as she spoke, giving impact to her words with explosive gestures. Heroes die every day, and that's with a powerful quirk. And for a while we thought you didn't even have one. How could I let you run off to get yourself killed? But as sudden as it came, all the energy left her, and she deflated like a punctured balloon. That's what I thought at the time, at least. I thought you'd give it all up if everyone was telling you it was impossible. But I should have known better. Her eyes met his own with something she'd always tried to hide behind a mask of indifference, admiration. You would have found a way to be a hero even this thing hadn't ever showed up, wouldn't you? She sighed with fond exasperation, though her eyes narrowed at the seemingly innocuous glob of metal floating overhead. She frowned as it halted, vibrating in place aggressively. That usually meant, I'd appreciate it if you didn't assume what's best for me without asking Kaken. She broke her observation of the metal, hearing the heat in Izuku's tone, only to flinch at the sight of his clenched jaw and the tears welling in his eyes. She'd done that. Brought the kindest person she knew to tears with her actions. Platinum blonde bangs fell over her eyes as her head dropped once more in shame. God, she was acting like a fucking wimp today. Right as she started contemplating taking a leap off the branch in the hopes that the ground might swallow her up whole, she felt a warm pair of arms wrap around her comfortingly. You overlooked something in your plan, Izuku mumbled, breath tickling her neck. Katsumi almost didn't register his words, so overwhelmed was she at his casual display of affection. You never told me I couldn't be a hero. Katsumi froze. So he'd forgive her just like that. After all these years, she had forgotten for a moment who she was talking about. Forgotten that being selfless and forgiving came as naturally as breathing for the boy before her. For a moment she'd felt like it would be taking advantage of his kind nature by accepting Izuku's easy forgiveness, but decided even quicker that she didn't care, indulging quietly in the comfort of the embrace. The hell said you could hug me? She muttered half-heartedly. He didn't comment on the fact that she hadn't pulled away in the slightest. You're going to be a great hero, Izuku, he stilled. Not number 1, cheeky bastard. Nah, that spot's still mine, nerd. Chapter 4. And time goes on. Katsumi, she'd been suspended. For a week. Even worse, they'd suspended fucking Izuku too, and he hadn't even done anything. Apparently Ashikawa Kai, the unfortunate victim of her demonstration, was the son of one of the higher-ups with the school district. Even the idiot instigating the fight hadn't been enough to get her out of punishment. And what the fuck was a zero-tolerance policy? The principal had pulled whatever that was out of his ass for sure. That, along with destruction of public property and an unauthorized usage of quirks on school property, had been enough to push for the suspension, as if they'd ever fucking enforced that rule before. What a joke, she grinned. At least that punk, Ikai, had gone down with her, serving an equally severe punishment. It was a step back on her path to Yue, but that only meant she'd need to be even more flawless when she finally applied. Unfortunately, but certainly not unexpectedly, her mother hadn't seen it the same way. Katsumi had the misfortune of walking through the front door right when the school called her home phone to relay the news of her suspension. Mitsuki hadn't torn into her like that in years, but curiously, the Bakugo mother relented after Katsumi had mentioned she'd spent some of the morning ditching with Izuku. The old hag had always doted on the kinder boy like a son, always giving Katsumi shit about playing nice with him, but letting her get away with something so huge? Apparently, she had underestimated just how much her mother and Auntie Inko wanted their kids to get along, which brought her to her current predicament, standing outside the Midoriya apartment, with absolutely zero clue on how to proceed. Just knock? No, couldn't do that, that was a nightmare. How could she even contemplate being so brazen as to? No, wait, she was Bakugo motherfucking Katsumi, and she could go to her friend's house if she damn well pleased. Are you going to stand out there all day, hun? Katsumi let out a shriek, a small gout of flame reflexively leaving her palm. Oh, that is quite impressive, dear. At the door stood Midoriya Inko, wielding the same kind eyes and sunny disposition as her son, though this time they were widened slightly in amazement. Izuku is always raving about it, so it's nice to finally see it in person. What? Katsumi stuttered out. Ugh, she was doing that way too much lately. What was Auntie Inko talking about again? Inko seemed to stare right through her, leaving her feeling small in a completely different but no less effective way than her own mother. Her comment also made her realize that in distancing herself from Izuku, she had also deprived herself of the lovely woman standing in front of her. Your quirk, Katsumi-chan, Inko said. Oh. Yeah, she said, breaking eye contact and holding out an open palm, making it spark and pop with a thought. It was the way she'd always show people her quirk when meeting them for the first time. Katsumi had always found it funny to introduce such a destructive power with a glorified party trick, but the fact that Inko hadn't even seen her use her quirk yet was like a punch to the gut. She felt arms wrap around her in a tight embrace. It's good to see you after so long, Katsumi-chan. Oh, so this what she was missing. Yeah, you too, Auntie Inko. Oh, Izuku, oh. I'm a bit disappointed, nerd. There's not nearly enough All Might merch for a fanboy of your caliber, Katsumi said, peering around his room curiously. Was she weirded out? No, that wasn't it. But for some reason Izuku was nervous about having Katsumi alone in here. Things were simple as 4-year-olds, but this Katsumi was older, and much more unfamiliar to him. He talked a big game the day of the fight, but now, without emotions flying high, he was having trouble deciding how he should act. He eyed the girl as she shamelessly explored his room, quick steel twirled in place with his pensive mood. Katsumi was looking more and more like a slenderer version of her mother every day. He'd sometimes heard his classmates make fun of her boyish haircut, never in the blonde's hearing range of course, but in his opinion, they couldn't have been more wrong. He'd always though it suited her. In fact, her whole outfit today was particularly flattering, as simple as it was. She looked really cute in holy shit, Kaken was a girl. This may have seemed like an obvious observation, but to Izuku it came with a whole host of other issues. Primarily, he had a girl in his room. What could be ignored as a toddler was all too apparent as almost teenagers, as Izuku had already had a particularly embarrassing talk on the subject with his mother just a few months previously. Luckily, Katsumi seemed preoccupied enough with her investigation to notice his miniature breakdown. Deep breaths, Izuku, you know her. It was just like when they were kids, except he'd been yearning for her to see him as an equal for years. And now she was probably the prettiest girl he knew. No! Stop, Esti. He snapped out of his thoughts at the sound of Katsumi rifling through a box of his old manga volumes, the ones they'd sit in his room looking at for hours as kids. The furniture hadn't really changed all that much since she'd last seen it, but it was the decor that was the real difference. She'd already known about his obsession with heroes, of course, since she'd kind of started it. He still remembered the day Katsumi had told him all about what a hero was. She was most likely just repeating something her mother had told her. But the next day Izuku had come over, having spent the previous night begging his mother to help him watch hero videos online. Katsumi had proclaimed him a hero nerd for the very first time, before they launched into a discussion about who their favorites were. Or, in Cantonese, which hero kicked the most butt. There were All Might posters, of course, not to mention a couple figurines of the muscular hero at choice locations around his room. But as Izuku had gotten more proficient at tracking heroes over the years, he'd started documenting them in ways other than his hero notebooks. Primarily, taking snapshots of them in action. The entire wall over his computer desk was ordered chaos. From action shots of local heroes stopping petty crime, to evacuation pros handling large-scale disasters, the evidence was plastered all over the wall. He'd never invade a pro's privacy, of course, only taking shots when they were both in costume and on the job. Becoming a bit self-conscious as Katsumi continued to stare at the photos dominating the walls, Izuku felt obligated to offer some kind of explanation. I get around a lot, he said lamely. She stilled for a second, not turning to face him. Yeah, no kidding, being able to fly must make that a breeze, she said, turning to give him a look. Izuku shook his head with a grin. I'm not that daring, Kaken, you should know that. If some kid started flying around the city on floating metal board, it might draw a bit too much attention, she scoffed. Damn cops will let you get away with using your quirk to travel if it's weak, but if it's flashy like ours, there's no chance. Her fingers fondled the air as sparks danced across her palms like she was remembering a particularly unpleasant situation. Ours? Katsumi had said it so nonchalantly, but she had to have known what phrasing it like that meant to Izuku. Equating his quirk to her own level was the greatest compliment she could have given him. He didn't acknowledge it though. He knew she'd prefer it that way. Yup, that's what the longboard was for initially, he said, suppressing the grin threatening to split his face. I needed to practice my balance but couldn't use my quirk so blatantly around the city. And last Wednesday? That was true. Izuku had mixed feelings about the fight from 3 days ago. On one hand, the brawl and its aftermath had directly led to Katsumi and him talking again. This was something he hadn't even dared to hope for, only to avoid the disappointment when it never came to be. But on the other hand, he'd been suspended due to a technicality. By stepping in and stopping Kaken's explosion, he'd technically been a part of the fight. Zero-tolerance policies really were a bitch. Izuku almost wished he let her knock that idiot silly. After all, he'd known she'd been ambushed from the get-go. Katsumi didn't go looking for fights, she just finished them when kids wanted to take on the prodigy. The only reason he'd even stepped in was because he knew she sometimes got caught up in the moment. He knew she'd regret taking things too far, or at least the consequences of taking things too far. Since they'd both been suspended anyway, he shouldn't have bothered. But that wasn't the thinking of a hero, and Izuku hadn't actually had the time to think before he moved. He hadn't thought that the older boy he'd saved from Katsumi's rage would rat him out along with her though. Though in the long run it wasn't surprising, he'd learned long ago that even those aspiring to be heroes were still human. They were capable of jealousy and greed, and indeed, they could be cruel. That was a special circumstance, he said after a moment. She hummed noncommittally, peering at some of the hand-drawn diagrams pinned throughout all the photos and posters. What about these, the first designs for my skyboard? Izuku said, joining her in front of the drawing. I can't really make things on the fly, so I have to plan them out ahead of time, then practice until it's second nature. I haven't really had time to test it much in the city, but even after the short time I had the other day, there are some things I'd like to too. What does your quirk really do, nerd? Katsumi said suddenly, cutting off his lapse in focus. She tried to be nonchalant, but Izuku could tell she was burning with curiosity. Trying to take me head-on was reckless, she added softly. You trying to die? Izuku couldn't help but laugh at that. And here I thought you pulled that explosion to avoid hurting the guy. Was I mistaken? Would he have died if I didn't block it? Shut up, nerd, I ain't that soft. She scowled. He stopped his laughter but retained his smile. Under that prickly exterior she really was, but he'd let it go for now. As for what I can do, he brought his palms up at waist level, metallic orb revolving slowly in between. I call it quick steel, and it's quite a bit more useful than we both initially thought, he said, grinning at Katsumi's narrowed eyes. Izuku ceased the orb's movement before separating 4 smaller spheres from the central mass, commanding them to whiz around each other in the imitation of an atom. At first I could only move it around and it always stayed a liquid. Katsumi prodded suspiciously at the quick steel, frowning as it wobbled in place. So you can harden it then? She bit out. Essentially, but there's a step in between, Izuku said, enjoying keeping the girl in suspense. Just spit it out, nerd, I don't got all day. We're both suspended, Kaken. Where could you have to go? He laughed. Shut up. Just tell me already. Katsumi fumed. Izuku grinned but conceded. For some reason I can manipulate the temperature of the material itself. Whether it's an ability I got from my dad's flame breath quirk or something else, I'm not really sure. Izuku pinched his thumb to the middle and forefingers of both hands, then stretched his arms apart, the quick steel thinning and lengthening in response. He snatched the newly formed rod out of the air, solidifying it as his skin made contact. He twirled it slowly between his hands. Lower it under its melting point, and it turns to a solid, he said, holding the quick steel staff aloft with a smile. I can only make basic weapons right now, but most of my training was focused on this. He liquefied the staff and coated his hand like a second skin, flexing his fingers experimentally. Well, this and learning to skyboard, but that was just me being selfish, he said a bit self-consciously. TCH, hero nerd, Katsumi said under her breath. That's pretty fucking cool. Praise? From Kaken? Oh, I quit smiling so much, it's creepy as hell. He tried, he really did. For the next couple of hours, they fell into a familiar routine, hanging out and catching up with what they'd missed of each other after all of these years. Izuku wasn't surprised to learn that Katsumi had started learning Muay Thai, thinking it would complement her quirk better than other martial arts. He agreed, especially after she'd demonstrated a few simple katas for him. The concentration on elbow and knee blows could be enhanced with explosions from her palms, and maybe even the bottoms of her feet. It was an idea she'd apparently toyed with in the past, but the sweat glands on her feet weren't capable of secreting her explosive yet. The thought was intriguing to say the least. Could her sweat glands be expanded? It made sense for her to be capable sending explosions from her feet as well. Izuku's quirk had undergone many stages since it had appeared, so he was confident someone like Katsumi would figure hers out no sweat. Well, not really, but Izuku had eagerly regaled her with the tales of an up-and-coming hero that had made an impressive showing at the most recent UA Sports Festival. He dedicated practically an entire chapter to the rookie's quirk, Arbor. Izuku would never expect her to share the same enthusiasm he had for quirk analysis, but honestly, just having her tolerate it was enough. She even appeared interested at some points, especially when he brought up some clips from the finals. She'd agreed that Nishiya Shinji would most likely be a popular hero when he made his debut. His mom called them for dinner not too much later, and Katsumi was treated to his mother's famous katsudon for the first time in years. Izuku couldn't help but laugh as she flooded her bowl with extra spicy sauce, and that was after his mom had made Katsumi's breading with hot chili flakes. They'd scarfed down their own portions, both having a second round as well. It was Izuku's favorite dish after all. Before he knew it, he was watching his first friend's retreating frame as she walked towards the stairs of his apartment complex. You're sure you don't want me to walk you home? Geez, let it go, nerd, it's just around the block. She sighed, rubbing at her nose. All right then, see you Monday. I'm suspended until Wednesday, she said drily. Oops. Wednesday then, he said with a laugh. Katsumi paused at the stairs that led to the first floor of Izuku's apartment complex. You want to see my mom too, right? She said, glancing away after a moment. Huh, you can come over tomorrow, she's been asking about you. Katsumi shot him a glare without any heat. Just come over around noon, nerd. And with that she stomped off with a huff, making her way down the stairs complex. Izuku kept an eye on her retreating form until she was just about to disappear around the corner, uncomfortable with letting her walk home in the dark no matter what she said. A buzz from his pocket interrupted his thoughts. A message from Katsumi? She'd just given him her number earlier today after she'd found out he actually owned a cell phone. Kaken, 8:23 p.m. Quit staring, nerd, it's creeping me out. Izuku slumped against the wall by the door of his apartment. So cruel. So why the hell haven't you pounded those idiots yet anyway? What? Izuku said, not following the abrupt question. It had been 2 weeks since the day Katsumi had visited his house for the day, and though it wasn't as obvious as when they were children, they'd spent nearly every day together in some capacity since then. He had indeed been welcomed with open arms by Auntie Natsuki when he'd visited the next day and was still puzzling out her brash proclamation as he'd walked through the doors. She'd been glad Katsumi finally grew a pair, whatever that meant, and wrapped him into a tight hug. The fact that she had inadvertently planted his face right into her generous cleavage had been an interesting start to the visit. Izuku may have improved his social skills a bit, but he'd still been sporting an atomic blush as Katsumi practically kicked him up the stairs to her room. Family friend she may be, but Bakugo Mitsuki was still drop-dead gorgeous on her worst day. What Deku? Quit zoning out, Izuku hid a smile. Last weekend Kaken had brought up the fact that he still called her by that dumb nickname, calling it childish. He knew he'd never have been able to call her Katsumi after so long, so he doubled down instead. She'd flipped out when he told her to call him Deku. But how could he not like that name? It was a nickname she'd given him, and she never said it with any bad intention. Katsumi caved surprisingly easy after he'd voiced his reasoning. What was the question again? The extras, why haven't you beat them down yet? She huffed. They hardly bother me anymore, so what's the point? The point is to show them the difference between us and the commoners, she said, punching her fist in her palm with an explosion. I don't know why you don't at least show off your quirk. They'd probably back the fuck off if they even knew what you could do. That actually made a lot of sense. Izuku paused for a moment before replying. It was something he'd found helped with his stuttering problem when he was younger, which had often resulted from feeling rushed to get his point across. Simply taking a step back to think about what he had to say helped immensely. I guess since I've been keeping it to myself for so long that it would feel weird to flaunt it. He rushed to clarify, seeing her about to interject. It's not like I'm afraid to stand up to them. It's just, our goal is UA, right? So I don't really have anything to gain by winning them over. I don't really know how to explain it right, he said, frowning in thought. No, I understand perfectly, she said, nodding seriously. The extras aren't worth your time. Kaken, that's not WH. Relax, Deku, we've only got 6 more years of this shit, then we're outta here. She stuffed her hands into the big pouch of her white hoodie, as if the matter was settled. He sighed. Convincing the prideful girl to see her classmates as any more than stepping stones was not a chore Izuku was willing to undertake. He instead carved back and forth as much as the narrow boardwalk allowed while still keeping pace with the walking Katsumi. The gentle sway of the motion eased his mind as he simply enjoyed the constant growl of wheels on concrete. It took a mere 5 more minutes to reach their destination. The towering piles of mechanical junk loomed over the pair as they plodded through the soft sand of Dagoba Municipal Beach. What are we doing here, nerd? Katsumi bit out from his side. This is where I've done the majority of my quirk training, he explained, squeezing his way through an opening in the junk heap. The path opened up into a clearing that spanned around a third of the beach. Welcome to my humble slice of paradise, he drawled theatrically. He turned to see a wide-eyed Katsumi admiring the beautiful horizon. The sun lit up her hair so it glowed like liquid fire. She seemed a bit ethereal in that moment, mesmerized as she was by the sight. Izuku was as well. You did all this? Katsumi said after a moment. He coughed into a fist, trying to cover how he'd been staring. Every weekend for 6-ish hours a day. Not that it was all spent clearing the beach. He waved dismissively. I've experimented too and practiced flying over the sand. She seemed lost in thought but eventually spoke up, eyes resolute. Why are we here? I actually need your help testing something, he said, and Katsumi perked up in interest. When I blocked your explosion before, I felt really drained afterwards. He clenched his fist, pondering the cause. It was weird because my quirk had never had any drawbacks like that before and I wanted to find out why. Don't you think it would be stranger if you didn't have a drawback to your quirk, nerd? You of all people should know how emitter types work. He nodded along with her point. I'd always written it off as a side effect of my quirk's mutation from my mother's. If I had simple telekinesis, it would be strange to have no side effects from overuse. But the quick steel itself is a part of my quirk, and my telekinesis is limited to that mass of metal alone, not to mention it's grown along with my body. Izuku paused to think for a moment. I thought that might have warranted a mutant classification, where physical drawbacks from overuse are less common. He shrugged. Guess I was wrong. Izuku ignored her muttered hero nerd in favor of taking several paces away and turning to face her. He placed a palm on his quick steel, molding it into a simple convex shield. He whirled it through the air to face Katsumi, brushing just the tips of his fingers along the interior. He found that at his current level just a touch was enough to keep quick steel in its solid state and braced in place. Think you can give me a blast around the same strength as before? He gave her a confident grin over the top of his shield. Don't get cocky, Deku, she said with a fierce smile. Katsumi didn't even hesitate as she strode forward, a flexed palm flickering with tiny sparks. She dashed the last few steps, unleashing a vicious explosion that rung like a gong against his quick steel. Fire and sand filled his vision as the force of the blast upset the ground beneath them. His shield held strong, but he once more felt that same fatigue come over him. That was expected, and part of the reason they were there in the first place. TCH, not even a dent, huh? Katsumi drawled, rapping her knuckles against his shield. Alright then, see if you can handle this. Kaken, wait! She froze with an arm cocked back, air around her fists blurring from the heat. Ugh, what now? That was just a baseline. I need you to reduce the heat in the next explosion but keep the power the same. You can do that, right? It's creepy that you know that, nerd, Izuku shrugged. I've seen you fight enough at school. I think I have a decent handle on your abilities. He was downplaying that a bit. Kaken's hero entry took up as many pages as some of the top 10 in his hero analysis journals. She sighed. Fine, same power, low heat. You ready, nerd? A nod from Izuku and she let loose once more, a hissed. Die! Slipping from her lips as a sharp crack echoed over the beach. Izuku actually had to brace his forearm against the disc slightly, the power behind the blast formidable enough to force him back a bit. Just as he had suspected, the drain this time was not non-existent, but significantly lower than before. He'd been pondering the cause of the strange fatigue since the day it had first occurred. Why did blocking Katsumi's explosions drain him so much when he could haul refrigerators for hours without rest? The only explanation that he could come up with was the thermoregulatory aspect of his quirk. Solidifying quick steel required him to cool it to a temperature below its melting point, which fortunately was slightly higher than water's. Under normal conditions, cooling quick steel to a measly 5 degrees Celsius was effortless with skin contact, and even without he could now even pick up small objects. The problem came when external heat was introduced to the equation, i.e. Katsumi's explosions. In this case, Izuku now had to expend energy to keep quick steel at a constant temperature in order to retain its solid state. That's where the drain came from. It was a subtle limitation to his power, but would be a fatal weakness against the right opponent. So, you've got your answer, Deku? Katsumi's voice cut through his thoughts. You've got that stupid look on your face, he smiled. Yeah, thanks, Kaken. I guess we can go now. Whoa, hold up just a fucking second. You think you can just show me you can take some of my stronger hits, on a beach away from noise complaints, and you think you're just gonna walk away with 2 hits? I don't fucking think so. Her palms glistened in the sunlight, and Izuku caught the cloying scent of burnt sugar on the breeze. What had he gotten himself into? Oh, Katsumi-o. How about dynamite? Izuku asked, and with a glance she confirmed that, yes, he was being serious. Deku, I didn't think it was possible, but you may have just out-nerded yourself. I'm not gonna be a hero with such a lame-ass name. Of course, he was undeterred, scratching his chin in thought as he tried to come up with another title. He'd been at it all morning as they walked to school together. Well, she walked. Izuku just coasted by her side on his board as usual. She'd made an offhand comment that she appreciated the simplicity of All Might's hero name, which had led to her current headache. What about dynamite? He muttered under his breath. She paused. That actually wasn't that bad. Kaken, I wasn't serious. You can't have a hero name like that, she cackled merrily. Then don't suggest a name if you don't like it. It had been nearly a year since they had started talking again, and Katsumi couldn't remember a time in her admittedly short life where she had laughed so freely. She couldn't pinpoint one particular cause, but Izuku seemed to brighten all aspects of her day in a way. He was the friend she missed, the rival she never had, and with the way he sometimes looked at her, she thought there might be something else. But each time her mind strayed to such dangerous territory, she quickly nipped that kind of thinking in the bud. There was no way he'd ever look at her like a girl, not with her brash personality, foul mouth and violent streak a mile long. She turned to see him scribbling in a familiar notebook, however this one looked battered and worn with age. What have you got here? With lightning precision, she snatched the book out of his hands, laughing at his indignant squawk. He seemed to sigh with resignation as she peered curiously at the cover. Volume 1? I thought you had a gazillion of these things filled. Why are you writing in Volume 1? He hesitated slightly. Well, I was writing all the names I could come up with so I didn't forget them. Yeah, and? She pressed. He looked at her as if she was missing something obvious. Who do you think was the first entry in my notes? Oh. A warm something welled within her before she silently opened the notebook to the first page. At the top was the title just like every other entry in his hero notes. Subject, Bakugo Katsumi. Quirk, explosion. Following was the most comprehensive breakdown of her abilities she had ever seen. The pages following had obviously been edited and amended several times over the years. Sticky notes were plastered to the pages with additional information as it was discovered. Unconfirmed theories followed, and she wasn't surprised that many of them were spot on. The nerd was usually right about that kind of stuff. Interspersed throughout the factual analysis was the odd personal commentary from Izuku himself, most of it incredibly flattering to the blonde girl. She knew her quirk was powerful, but she also had the perspective of how much work was put into the finesse she wielded it with. To have that effort acknowledged left her with a strange fuzzy feeling in her gut. She didn't hate it. It's fucking creepy that you know more about my quirk than I do, nerd. That's what she said, but she couldn't quite hide the flush that she felt warm her cheeks. Creepy? Kaken, you know it's not like that. She snickered at how his voice cracked with indignation, turning back to the notes that actually had a few good ideas she had yet to try. The tentative hero name section was worth a good laugh, with gems on the level of nitroglycerin or Dabam scrawled and crossed out across the page, though names like Ignitro or Ground Zero were filed away for further thought. She hid a grin at the realization that Deku had been fucking messing with her, only mentioning the shittiest names he could think of. But it was when she reached the next section that she paused. Possible mutations? She said, somewhat afraid to ask. She noticed Izuku perk up a bit at her interest. Was he really so starved for attention? She'd have to be more blatant with her praise from now on. Katsumi knew she could come off as cold, but Izuku at least deserved more effort from her. Yeah, he started enthusiastically. Even if your quirk isn't a mutant type, there are still ways that your body adapts to use your power safely. Right, like how Endeavor doesn't torch himself. Izuku nodded. Right in one. In your case, you probably have something like higher bone density, or some kind of alteration to your musculature. He paused, looking over at her as he rolled along. To handle the kickback, you know, she glanced back to the pages of the notebook. Constricted pupils? The hell's that supposed to mean? Izuku rolled to a stop in front of her, wide, jade eyes peering curious into her own. God, he had changed. The nerd could never meet her eyes for too long before. Always staring at his shoes, head hung for some reason unknown to her. But curiously, it was her that had the urge to look away in embarrassment. His eyes were really pretty. That was just a guess, he said, cracking a smile. Our pupils constrict when they're exposed to extreme light. I think yours are particularly small to handle the constant flashes. With that, he rolled away, leaving her frozen in the middle of the street. That was the day Katsumi realized that Izuku really paid attention. The day that Endeavor burned down half of the Muzurafu shopping center was a wake-up call for Katsumi. Granted, it wasn't exactly clear who'd caused the majority of the damage. A villain with a emitter quirk that allowed him to boost his agility by expelling fire from his feet had been on some kind of mass shoplifting spree from the various storefronts, all while wreaking havoc on the general populace. It was the kind of lawbreaking that would disrupt your day but otherwise be written off as petty crime. Unfortunately, the situation had escalated when Endeavor had arrived on the scene and attempted to apprehend the criminal. By the time Katsumi had tuned into the live streams broadcasting the situation, there were several buildings already engulfed in flames, and several more following quickly. It was with intrigued horror that Katsumi watched from the safety of her room as people trampled each other to escape the burning plaza. The villain was eventually captured, but by that point the damage had been done, and most of it not by him. Endeavor was already facing public backlash, his careless pursuit of a relatively minor villain causing millions in property damage. Even his number 2 spot on the billboards was coming into question. The already palpable outrage from the endangered shoppers and their families was only twisted and exaggerated. To add insult to injury, Izuku had come racing into her room soot-smudged and exhausted, asking if she'd seen the news. Apparently, he'd been passing by while chasing down another hero when shit hit the fan. Of course she'd seen the damn news. But what the hell had the nerd been doing down there? His dismissive explanation that he'd only been helping get people out of danger hadn't calmed her in the slightest. Nor did she believe his insistence that he wasn't even using his quirk. Though that may have been her worry asserting its presence. The whole situation was reminding her of why she hadn't wanted him to be a hero in the first place. He was hardly defenseless anymore, and didn't need her to worry for him. Not that she would ever stop. But perhaps most impactful of all was the realization that for all of Endeavor's power, some quirks were simply not suited for certain situations. In the most literal sense of the phrase, fighting fire with fire would most certainly lead to someone getting burned. She'd always held her own quirk in the highest regard, feeling it was both versatile and powerful enough to handle any situation. But evidence to the contrary was currently staring her in the face. What was truly terrifying was how easily that could have been her, a hero that was undisputedly strong yet completely helpless to offer aid. That idea had wedged itself in her psyche, self-doubt plaguing her thoughts. It had gotten to the point where Izuku had noticed something was up as they sat together finishing their homework for the following school day. She was glad that he took some time to really consider her worries, rather than offer useless platitudes like nearly anyone else would have. I don't think you'll have to worry about that, Kaken. What are you talking about, nerd? Were you watching the same thing I was, he said abruptly, and Katsumi was startled by the steel in his eyes. I was there, remember? There were plenty of injuries. Luckily nothing particularly lethal, but it was a shit situation all around. Then why? Your quirk is more versatile than Endeavor's for one. You can already adjust the destructive capabilities of your explosions, Not to mention you can use them purely for mobility," he said simply. That was true. She could tweak her secretions to have more heat or concussive force and had been practicing practically since she first got her quirk. But more importantly, Katsumi looked up from her math homework to face her friend once more. More importantly, you're already thinking about the consequences of such careless quirk use. He grinned. That alone makes me think that you won't run into the same problems. She deflated a bit. Maybe she'd been worried for nothing, but when the hell had Izuku gotten so wise? She rifled through her box of green teapaki and stuck out 2 sticks to her friend while looking the other way with a scowl. You're welcome, Kaken, he said happily, grabbing one of the treats, leaving the other for her. The hell is that supposed to mean, nerd? She refused to acknowledge the heat that rose to her cheeks. She'd been telling the old hag to fix the thermostat for ages. It wasn't her fault that no one listened to her around here. Chapter 5. Blade Dance. Oh Izuku oh. It was during the summer of his first year at Aldera High that Izuku finally committed to something he'd been putting off for a long while. With good reason. He was finally at the age where weight training wouldn't permanently damage his growing body. Rather than pushing his proficiency with his quirk any further, he instead shifted his focus to building the natural strength of his body. At first, it was like starting his training all over again. Not to mention it was a harsh reminder that despite the imitation strength granted by his quirk, he was still a fairly thin young man. Sure, he was athletic enough from the constant riding around the city, but he wasn't even close to a hero's level of fitness. Not the kind of hero he wanted to be anyway. So, for the remaining third of Dagoba Beach that was still covered in junk, Izuku began hauling using only his body's natural strength. Having started during summer break, Izuku at least had time to acclimate to his new schedule before the school year resumed. The first few weeks were agony to the aspiring hero, and he found himself crawling into bed unable to do much else at the end of each day. His limbs, as well as the muscles and ligaments that moved them, hadn't really had experience lifting any seriously heavy loads, leaving Izuku's body no stronger than any other child his age may have been. He still had his active lifestyle to fall back on, but from the standpoint of sheer power, he was certainly lacking. The first days were rough, but eventually, he made progress. School started again, and his workouts were restricted to before and after class within reason. His mother would never let him live it down if his grades fell as a result of his heroic pursuits. Katsumi and he both hung out when they could, finding that they were both focused on their own training now that the UA entrance exam was more of a reality than just a far-off goal. But even then, they managed to meet for joint training sessions whenever Katsumi wasn't busy with her martial arts. The more time Izuku spent with the girl, the more he realized his feelings toward his best friend may have been less than platonic, not that it was any amazing realization. Even as a toddler, when romantic thoughts were the furthest thing from his mind, Katsumi was always someone to be admired. But as that fiery blonde child had grown into a beautiful young woman before his eyes, how could he help but be enamored with her? With those striking crimson irises that glowed like embers when the light hit them just right. Was it wrong to push her button slightly just to have that smoldering glare leveled at him every now and then? Perhaps. But he couldn't find it in himself to regret it. With so many emotions running through his mind, how could he not have such puzzling thoughts for her? That afternoon, Katsumi was again busy with her Muay Thai classes, leaving Izuku ample time for such idle thoughts as he watched the sun set over the nearly pristine horizon of Dagoba Beach. Once he had gotten used to the strenuous routine, his progress had been steady, and after several months of manually hauling trash, he had nearly cleared the remaining garbage that had once marred the west side of the beach. Other than the larger vehicles and awkwardly shaped hunks of metal he couldn't manage to lift, the beach was nearly devoid of trash, and the result was astounding. Izuku could hardly recognize the place. This had all started as a training exercise. He would never in a million years believed himself capable of coming close to what he'd accomplished. He leaned back in against his latest conquest, a broken-down washing machine by the looks of it, and took a rare moment to relax before he resumed his demanding training. But so captured was he by the nearly cleared skyline, Izuku missed a pair of attentive eyes trailing his form curiously. Boy! Here you stand clearing the waste of others, yet ask for no reward. Why? Izuku paused his set of suicides, having added extra drills in between loads as the junk littering the beach grew sparser, and turned to the man who had spoken. The voice was raspy, as if it hadn't been used in years, but it seemed to suit its owner in a way. Now that Izuku got a better look at him, his presence seemed to fill the beach despite standing with a distinct hunch, not much taller than Izuku's fairly average 165 centimeters. He stood perched on a tower of broken-down cars, like a gargoyle guarding some ancient Gothic church. The breeze blew his black, knotted hair, revealing a sharp, angular face and a thick bandage wrapped around his head. It covered the space between his misshapen gash of a mouth and bloodshot dark red eyes. An old injury, perhaps? Or maybe it was to cover a part of his quirk he found unappealing? A quirk society they may be, but prejudice unfortunately remained rampant. Even with race and other social categories being muddled by the infinite mutations that quirks made possible, people undoubtedly found a way to be spiteful to others who were different. The stranger's clothes were nondescript when compared to his physical features. The plain black cargo pants and a sleeveless tank top he wore revealed a corded musculature that seemed out of place on his relatively slender frame. It was the single battered katana that hung sheathed at the man's side, however, that gave Izuku pause. He resembled no hero that Izuku knew of, but that didn't really mean much. There were thousands of new applicants for hero licenses every year in Japan. It would be absurd to expect to keep track of every single student that passed. Not that he'd ever let that stop him from trying, but something about the man screamed danger, despite his relaxed posture. That was another thing. The man had seemingly shown up out of nowhere, but knew Izuku had been cleaning the beach. Sure, he could guess such information from watching for an hour or so, but assuming he cleaned the entire beach? Why was he there? For how long? Answer me, boy. The man spoke up, taking a lurching step towards Izuku. The metal spire he stood upon creaked ominously. His instincts urged him to answer for some reason, and Izuku obliged, seeing no harm in the information. I want to be a hero. Something changed in the man's expression. Is that so? Izuku was surprised such a hoarse voice could sound so delicate. He spoke as if trying to grasp a concept that was utterly foreign to him. Another perilous step. Izuku's blood seemed to freeze in his veins, a gripping, unrelenting fear filling his being. The air seemed to turn to sludge, each breath a battle, leaving him paralyzed at the sensation. He had to leave. Get far, far away from this man and the oppressive force he used effortlessly. But something held him back, whether it was the sheer conviction in the man's eyes or his own fear. Something stopped him from turning tail to run. Why? Izuku almost missed it when the dark-haired man spoke again. Why? What was he asking? It took several seconds for his brain to catch up with the conversation. Why he wanted to be a hero? Well, that was easy. Because I want to help people. He managed to choke out. The answer was simple enough, but any further explanation would be an unnecessary complication. Izuku admired All Might, but not because he was number one. It was because he inspired people to hope with his presence alone. Katsumi would be much better suited to the number one spot, but as long as people could see Izuku flying into danger and think everything's going to be okay now, then he would be happy. The stranger seemed almost confused at his answer, before his expression hardened into something more sinister. Words can be quite powerful, boy, but ultimately meaningless. He scoffed, and Izuku flinched at the man's first show of emotion since his sudden appearance. But Izuku was more concerned with how the man flickered, disappearing in an instant from his perch atop the tower of old Toyotas. Izuku's head darted from side to side, trying to locate the strange man, reassessing the threat he posed all the while. A speedster? Guess his bandage was just an injury after all. Before he could pursue that line of thought any further, Izuku's world was tilted on its axis. He suddenly found himself flat on his back, a heavy, reinforced boot forcing what little air he had left out of his lungs. He stilled, heart racing at the metallic hiss of a katana leaving its sheath, and the cool bite of metal settling against his neck a moment later. Be still. The man rasped, either utter unconcerned with the situation or a very talented actor. Izuku's quick steel hovered uncertainly overhead, torn between its master's instinctual need to be free, and the logical decision to avoid being beheaded. For a moment, cold fear spiked through Izuku. His offensive and defensive capabilities, while formidable, were not autonomous. They were entirely reliant on his own perception and how fast his mind could react to various events, subconsciously or otherwise. The fact that this man, no, this monster could move faster than Izuku could think, was both terrifying and enlightening. He'd have to find a way to overcome this obvious weakness. That is, if he ever managed to get out of this situation alive. The man stared uncaringly down the blade of his sword toward Izuku as the boy tried and failed to inch even a centimeter away from the razor-sharp edge. It felt like an eternity before the man spoke, though it may have only been seconds. The girl from before, the blonde that was with you, tell me everything you know about her and I'll let you go. A sting of pain followed by a hot trail inching across his skin indicated the increased pressure of the man's blade, but Izuku's mind was elsewhere. Kaken! What could he want with her? Was that the whole reason this maniac was here in the first place? The pain and asphyxiation were distracting and making it hard to think clearly, but air could wait. First he had to get himself out of this situation. He gritted his teeth, letting out a hiss of pain, eyes narrowed dangerously at the man holding him hostage but mouth remaining stubbornly shut. Last chance, boy. This was it. He was out of time. He had to risk taking him out with quick steel faster than the man could move his blade. Izuku knew, judging from the man's casual show of speed, it was a long shot, and that was being generous. Now, but his lance of quick steel swished through air, as the man strolled a few meters away before turning to watch the horizon. His aggressive posture and the pressure he exuded had vanished entirely, leaving Izuku heaving disbelievingly on the ground, quick steel primed and ready to attack at the slightest provocation. A budding hero with conviction, huh? The man tilted his head curiously and peered over at Izuku. I suppose there are outliers to every rule. Izuku barely caught what the man said under his breath, but it had only served to confuse him further. His heart was still hammering in his chest as he sucked in lungfuls of air, and he may or may not have been suffering from an adrenaline crash. Disoriented as he was, all he could manage was a simple, your physical skills are still weak, boy. I subdued you in an instant and there was nothing you could do. The man rasped, ignoring Izuku's ineloquent response. Was this guy fucking insane? Are you fucking insane? Dark pupils pierced Izuku, and his mouth clamped shut of its own volition. Perhaps it hadn't been the best decision to curse at the homicidal maniac that had had him at blade point not 60 seconds previously. What will you do about it? What? Your weakness? What is your solution? Izuku was so confused. This guy had come out of nowhere demanding answers from him, and then the next thing Izuku knew the guy was slicing him up like a side of beef and demanding to know about. Izuku hopped off the ground and was in the air in a split second. His skyboard vibrated in agitation as he hovered at what he had deemed a safe altitude. Who are you and what do you want with Kaken? He growled down at the figure below, who hadn't shown any indication of noticing Izuku's abrupt movements. Ka-chan, the man said slowly, as if tasting the word on his lips. Ah, the blonde one? Right, she was merely a means to an end. What the hell is that supposed to mean? Izuku shouted. He couldn't be serious, right? The man hadn't made another aggressive move since then, but Izuku wouldn't let his guard down so easily a second time. It was a logical ruse, a test, so to say. He seemed to grow melancholy for a moment. I've been traveling around Japan lately in search of a new path. The words held a certain weight to them, but whatever that meant was beyond Izuku's current understanding. He descended to just above eye level with the man still keeping his distance. I was here yesterday as well, saw you and the girl, he said, rolling his eyes. That just now was more of a spur-of-the-moment decision. His eyes narrowed, inspecting Izuku like a surgeon would his tools. People like you are a rarity these days. In this world full of fakes, Izuku was stunned. That was a test? I'm bleeding over here. Don't be so dramatic, boy, it won't even need a bandage. You're one to talk. Izuku muttered under his breath. The man didn't respond for nearly a minute, and for a moment Izuku thought he might have gone too far. Chi, the short syllable cut through the silence like a gunshot. What? You asked who I was? I have been called Chi before. His voice was gruff, but not unkind. Right. Izuku didn't quite know what to say. This guy, Chi-san, was all over the place. The ghost of that terrifying pressure still echoed in his mind, but if the man's explanation was to be believed, and that was still up for debate, then he had never meant any harm. You noticed it too, yes? WH. Stop asking what? Think, boy. His skyboard lurched back at the burst of emotion from Chi and Izuku leveled it automatically. What had he been talking about before? He'd called him weak? And then, how will I fix it? A slow nod. There was of course the question of why Izuku was humoring the man in the first place. As insane as he appeared, he was right about one thing. Izuku was helpless to his assault, incapable of mounting even the most meager of defenses. It wasn't the only weakness his abilities had either. He had mobility and augmented strength in spades, but combat experience? Technique? He was sorely lacking. Quirks that granted immunity to physical attacks would utterly overwhelm him unless he took to the air. And that was all ignoring the natural weakness to heat that was built into his quirk. Somehow, he needed a way to get around even the worst matchups for his quirk possible. It's okay if you don't have an answer, I'm no teacher, but if you learn something from this, I don't care either way. Chi deliberately drew his katana once more, the scraping metal filling the empty coast with a ringing hiss. Izuku's eyes widened in alarm. Was he really doing this again? Did this guy just get off on attacking people out of nowhere? Why would I fight you? Someone who ambushed me out of nowhere? Izuku questioned rhetorically. He was ready to simply fly home and leave this whole insane experience behind him. I want to be a hero, that's what you said, right? A cruel sneer came over Chi's features. Is your conviction really worth so little? Izuku froze. That couldn't be right. Of course he wanted to be a hero. It just made zero sense to humor this man that he had just met today, and under perhaps the worst circumstances possible. But would this always be his solution? Fly away and wait for someone else to take care of the problem? Inexplicably, Izuku found his bare feet settling in the still warm sand. What the hell was he doing? Chi's eyes bore into his own as he closed the distance, slowly at first but gradually hastening his approach. So, you've decided then? The tip of his katana left a shallow line in the sand. Do try not to die. Izuku avoided his apartment entirely after that first night. His mother may have already gotten used to his ardent training routine, but staggering into his home with bandages covering him nearly head to toe would probably be a bit too much. So instead, he made an executive decision and called ahead, letting her know he'd be at Katsumi's house. It was a simple matter: avoid Kaken's mother by flying through his friend's window. It's not that he was worried she wouldn't let him up here, he wasn't. In fact, Auntie Mitsuki was always oddly lenient with him, at least when compared to her daughter, but that was a whole other topic. Izuku avoided her for the very same reason he avoided his own mother. He knew she'd fuss over him, in her own way. Though her daughter hadn't been much better. Katsumi had been understandably irate when he came through the window wrapped up like a mummy. But for all her worry disguised as aggressive demands, Izuku knew she would keep this between the two of them. At least if he managed to convince her that he wasn't in any immediate danger. And so, he told her the tale of a man named Chi and how he may have just become Izuku's bootleg sensei. Oh, Deku! Katsumi mused nearly a half hour later. If this guy's as strong as you say he is, then why haven't we even heard of him before? That was a good question. At first Izuku had written it off as a case of a recent license recipient who had yet to make his hero debut. But that explanation became less and less viable as the night went on and Izuku witnessed the true scope of Chi's abilities. Time and time again he'd been humbled by this stranger, who Izuku knew was holding back. The man had hardly broken a sweat after all. Every cut delivered to the aspiring hero had been precise, barely deep enough to draw blood, yet painful enough to be a hindrance, opening up his guard to subsequent attacks. But Izuku had taken Chi's words to heart. Little by little, he was observing, learning, and adapting. Hardest of all to come to terms with was the brutality of a true fight, something he hadn't really experienced up to this point in his life. By the end of the night Izuku was hopeful he'd take just a few more seconds to subdue than when he'd started. Earth to Deku, Kasumi said, flicking him in the forehead. She was leaned over him, peering into his eyes, her left arm braced on the right arm of his chair. South close. His eyes widened as he realized he was close enough to notice light flecks of gold in her crimson eyes. His face lit up like a beacon, causing Katsumi back away abruptly. He was seriously losing it around this girl. Rather than acknowledging what had just happened, Izuku instead answered her question. She did say he had been traveling recently. Maybe he's one of those heroes that sticks to defending a single area. Local heroes weren't unheard of, but Izuku knew this explanation was flimsy at best. Look, Deku, we both know this guy is fucking sketchy, and that's just from you telling me about him. She sighed deeply, her voice growing quiet. I won't stop you if you think this is the right choice, not again. Izuku barely caught that last part, but it seemed she wasn't finished. Just be the fuck careful, he could do that. Izuku grinned at the fiery blonde. A show of worry like that was rare for her, and Izuku was equally concerned. But if this was the path to be the best hero he could be, then he couldn't afford to pass it up. How are you gonna explain the bandages to Auntie Inko? Katsumi said, trying to lighten the mood. He walked over to her closet and grabbed one of her many plain hoodies. Despite Izuku having shot up in height the last few months, much to the blonde's ire, Katsumi had an enormous collection of pullovers, some of which would fit him in a pinch. It would be fine until he could get past his mother and in his room. Sure, take my clothes, not like I fucking need them, she drawled, flopping onto her bed with her phone and a pair of earbuds. Appreciate it, Kaken. Whatever, nerd. Night. Yeah? She had spoken the truth that night. He was no teacher. In fact, it was almost a full month before Izuku even saw the man again. But somehow, he had managed to inject the urgency he had felt that night into his own personal training. Izuku pushed his body to the absolute limit, and when he was broken and bleeding, he went even further beyond, improving at rates he would have thought impossible. Where at the beginning of the most recent summer break Izuku would struggle to lift microwaves, he could now haul fridges through the sand, though not without significant effort. Quick Steel acted as a personal spotter in a way, letting him take on bigger and bigger challenges without worry of injuring himself. Izuku wasn't at all surprised when Kaken had upped the intensity of her training to match his own, especially when she saw the results his routine had had so far on his growing body. At least, that's what she'd said when he'd caught her staring that one time. They sparred regularly in order to make sure their power could be put into practice. After all, what was the point of all the strength in the world if there was no finesse to back it up? All Might could probably level cities with all that overwhelming power, but has never denied shaking the hand of a fan on the street. How would that be possible if not for absolute, equally overwhelming control? When Izuku's sensei next made an appearance, he came strapped with another pair of daggers and matching black wrist bracers. Izuku hardly thought the man needed any more sharp objects, but didn't comment. It wasn't even close to the strangest part about the man after all. She didn't waste time with idle words. So you've improved some. He drew his blade. Let's see how much, shall we? The man seemed even more ferocious than the night Izuku met him, flickering out of sight before a vicious slash clanged against Izuku's quick steel armor. It had barely finished hardening around his forearm but held strong under Chi's blade. Ah yes, such a versatile quirk, Hirokun, but can it keep up? Chi's smile stretched mockingly, vanishing from in front of him like a specter. The soft sand surrounding them was probably hampering the older man's speed more than Izuku would like to admit. He shuddered at the thought of what he could do in a proper environment. A puff of displaced sand indicated where the man would charge from, but once again Izuku's speed was lacking as she flickered by, leaving a familiar stinging pain on his left calf as he passed. He let out a hiss in agitation. Do you really have to cut me every time? A voice came from behind his left shoulder. How else will you learn unless there is a drawback to being so slow? Izuku swung a tendril of quick steel from a closed fist, sending it whipping through the air towards where he heard the disembodied voice. Another miss. I thought you weren't a teacher? Izuku called out, trying to locate his sensei. What seemed like a wrecking ball plowed into his back, knocking the wind out of him. Izuku found himself flat on his stomach, spitting out globs of dry sand from where he had face planted. I'm not, said Chi, though Izuku could not tell from where, horizontal as he was currently. But that doesn't mean you can't learn, Izuku sighed. How am I even supposed to keep up with someone with a speed enhancement quirk? She came to a stop, lounging against what looked like a beat-up old golf cart. Wrong, boy. You are still thinking too narrow-mindedly. People come with a wide variety of skill sets, not all of them related to their quirks. An uncharacteristic grin stretched over his terrifying mouth. Besides, hurting you with my quirk would be illegal. No, was he saying his speed wasn't his quirk? He'd seen Chi kick straight through car doors before in their spars. The thought that it wasn't the result of a supernatural ability was terrifying if her were being honest. What will you do when an opponent exceeds all your careful calculations and predictions? Give up? Cower in fear? If that's your answer, then it seems I've made an error in judgment of my own. Izuku struggled to his feet, spitting the last of the grit from his mouth. Fine then. Quirk or no quirk, he would overcome this obstacle, and he would be a hero. That was the day Izuku acknowledged that human potential could outshine any natural ability. But if he could embrace both? For the first time since that day almost a month previously, he felt he may have made the right decision, risking life and limb to humor this unpredictable man. This trend continued in the same vein for nearly his entire first and second years of high school. She would inconsistently show up while Izuku was out training, they would spar, and the man would dish out advice veiled as aloof observations. Sometimes he appeared 3 or 4 days in a row, and sometimes it would be a whole month between meetings. Chi's schedule was as inconsistent and unpredictable as the man himself. It took several meetings, but over time Izuku managed to deduce the secret behind the man's overwhelming strength and speed. In short, there was no secret, it was a product of backbreaking effort and dedication. In this superhuman society, people tended to ignore anything that didn't have a hand in something related to quirks. Products and advertisements were catered to the quirked individual. Clothes were styled to adapt to every shape and size. Jobs tested for quirk compatibility along with a merit-based screening, at least for those where a quirk would aid in efficiency. There were laws in place, of course, to avoid discrimination, but things always slipped through the cracks. It was essentially the basis of their society. But what went ignored was the sheer potential of the human body and those who had taken the next step in the evolutionary chain. Izuku had noticed it before, of course, though not in the same context. The bodies of humans with a quirk were practically wired to adapt to any harsh side effect of their ability. Why would any other form of stress on the body be any different? Breaking muscle down to build it back stronger was the basis of exercise, so why wouldn't the body's boosted adaptability apply to that as well? Average fitness scores worldwide had gone up since the quirk revolution, and this fact wasn't exactly hidden. But it was no astounding increase. The average person would never have any reason to push their body far enough to tap into that enormous potential. But Chi-sensei? Average? The thought itself was laughable. Chi had taken that simple concept and slammed it up into 8th gear, pushing through agonizing pain and fatigue, until the result was the power he now wielded. If Izuku managed even a fraction of what the man had, then it would be more than enough to cover up his quirk's drawbacks. Over time, Izuku did improve. While before Chi seemed to vanish from existence with his speed, Izuku could now recognize the predatory grace his sensei moved with. But more importantly, he could see him. His perception seemed to improve the fastest. Having to constantly track and avoid his sensei was proving dividends, and eventually, his body caught up to his mind. Izuku pushed himself to his physical limits, sometimes unable to pull himself into bed at night, but it all paid off the first time he had consciously managed to react to one of Chi's rushes. He merely deflected the first and second strike only to be domed by the hilt of his sensei's blade, but to Izuku, it meant he was closing the gap little by little. In the time that she was not present, Izuku studied up on various types of practical martial arts. Having no sensei dedicated to teaching a discipline, Izuku's technique was sorely lacking. But after repeatedly testing a grab bag of techniques from different arts in his brawls with his errant sensei, along with things he picked up from the man himself, Izuku slowly developed a style that was both versatile and synergized well with his quirk. Izuku often wondered what the man did in the time he spent away from him, but any search in hero databases had turned up blank. Izuku had checked several times. He was no villain, at least not one Izuku had heard of. And she just really didn't give off that vibe. Besides, how bad could someone willing to help out some nobody hero in training really be? Something was different that day. It was the break between his second and third years of high school, and Izuku's cord muscles rippled with the effort it took to drag the massive broken-down sedan inch by inch through the soft sand. It was one of the very last hunks of metal still marring Dagoba Beach. However, they were all pieces he had skipped over in the earlier years of his training, deeming them beyond his ability to move. Now, however, such a feat would be child's play, at least if he'd used his quirk. But Izuku was determined to clear the rest of the beach without such a crutch, so that's what he'd do. She showed up unannounced, but that wasn't strange in the least. Over the months the man had collected the arsenal of weapons that currently littered his figure. So when he arrived with new gear, Izuku barely blinked an eye anymore. However, typically, his tools could be matched to entirely functional purposes. Izuku had been skewered by throwing knives, butchered via katana and hogtied by metal wire more times than he could count. And the protective combat gear she wore now offered the most protection he could afford without hampering any of his overwhelming mobility. The addition this time, however, was a long, tattered scarf. It was blood red, the exact same color as the man's eyes, and seemed to serve no actual purpose besides making his already intimidating figure even more menacing. Izuku braced himself for the inevitable surprise attack, so was utterly surprised when no surprise came at all. She seemed to deliberate for a while, which was the second out-of-character action he'd made that day. But it all made sense when he finally spoke. "I'm moving on. If you're lucky, this will be the last time you see me." Huh. Well, that wasn't ominous in the slightest. Well, it wasn't exactly unexpected. Izuku had no illusions about where the man's loyalties lied. The fact that he had even come back to tell him at all was a miracle in itself. But Izuku would still miss the guy. His gruff personality had grown on him after a while. Not to mention he was way easier to like once their meetings stopped consisting of constantly getting sliced up. Despite knowing barely anything about the man, there was a certain bond you made with someone who constantly threatened your life. "I'll miss you, Chi-sensei," Izuku said with a bow. "I'm not your sensei, kid." His aura grew oppressive, evoking that same sense of dread just like all those months ago. "I trust you remember your goal?" Izuku shook off the pressure after a moment, having gotten used to the man's aura over their time together. He nodded resolutely, staring the man in the eyes no matter how intimidating they were. "Good," he said after a moment. "I can see the resolve behind those eyes, kid." He grew a bit somber. "Just remember to keep that resolve, no matter what kind of monster you end up fighting." Those were the last words she had for him before disappearing in a burst of speed, red scarf trailing him like macabre trail of blood. What a strange guy. Alright, legends, that's a wrap for part 1 of What If Deku Had Metal Manipulation. Huge thanks to BT for the incredible storyline. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to drop a like, share it with your friends, and leave a comment below with your thoughts and predictions for the next part. Your support means the world to me, and remember, this isn't the finale. There's much more to come, so stay tuned. Until next time, stay legendary.